What if Earth once knew how to begin again, and learned it only through forgetting? Wherever you are tonight, in the quiet between one thought and the next, I'm glad you're here. This is not a story meant to be understood all at once. It is meant to be rested into, like snow settling on stone, like time learning how to slow itself down. Tonight, the planet remembers the long, cold breaths it once held, not as disaster, not as spectacle, but as rewriting, as a hand moving gently across its own surface, erasing, reshaping, and leaving behind a silence that would one day learn how to speak again. The ice did not arrive suddenly. It never does. Cold is not an event. It is a decision made slowly, molecule by molecule, as the planet exhales more than it inhales. Long before the surface turned white, the Earth began to lean inward, drawing its warmth closer to its core, letting the outer skin cool like a quiet thought settling at the back of a mind. Snow fell without ambition. It did not seek to conquer. It simply stayed. One winter did not leave when it should have. Then another lingered. Time noticed. Time always does. At first, the land barely felt it. A dusting here, a longer frost there. Rivers learned to pause at their edges. Trees listened more closely to the silence between seasons. But ice is patient in a way stone respects. Snow remembers how to become itself again. Layer upon layer pressed down, not with force, but with presence. Weight accumulated like memory does, soft at first, then undeniable. The planet did not resist. Resistance requires urgency. Ice has none. As centuries passed, the white deepened. Snow forgot it had ever been water. Pressure taught it a new language. Crystals collapsed into one another. Air squeezed out. Light trapped and scattered until brightness became density. Ice was born not as cold, but as compression. Kilometers of frozen breath settled onto continents, resting there like a thought too heavy to finish. Beneath that weight, the ground grew quiet. Not dead, just listening. Mountains felt the touch first. Their sharpness dulled, their edges softened as if the planet were smoothing its own scars. Ice does not carve with blades. It presses, drags, remembers where it has been. As glaciers began to move slowly enough to feel like stillness, they carried fragments of the world inside themselves. Stones, soil, broken peaks. The land was lifted, relocated, rewritten without ceremony. Valleys were not created. They were revealed, uncovered by what was removed. Nothing screamed. There was no sound loud enough to travel through that much cold. Even friction learned to whisper. Beneath the ice, rock fractured not from impact, but from patience. Grain by grain, mountains were lowered into sentences the future could read. The planet was not erasing itself, it was simplifying, reducing complexity into forms that could endure longer than memory. Time during the ice ages did not pass forward. It sank downward. Years compressed into layers like pages pressed together in a book never meant to be opened. Each snowfall added another line to the surface. Each summer that failed to melt it added punctuation. The earth learned how to hold its breath for tens of thousands of years. In that stillness, nothing hurried, nothing needed to. The sky above grew pale, stretched thin by reflection. Sunlight arrived, touched the ice, and returned upward, unsure of what it had seen. Days passed without warmth. Nights lengthened without fear. The planet did not feel abandoned by the star it circled. It understood distance. Ice teaches distance. It teaches the value of space between moments. Beneath the frozen weight, rivers slept. Their paths did not vanish. They waited. Pressure rearranged minerals in the dark. Rocks learned new alignments. Carbon slowed its wandering. Oxygen lingered longer in silence. Chemistry became introspective, folding inward, preserving possibilities instead of expressing them. Life did not flourish here. It conserved. Survival became a quieter art. The ice moved without intention, but not without consequence. It dragged continents into new shapes. It scraped histories from surfaces and scattered them across distances too vast to remember. What once stood tall was spread thin. What once was thin gathered elsewhere, thick with future. This was not destruction. It was translation. And through it all, the planet remained awake, not alert, not afraid. Awake in the way stone is awake, in the way pressure knows exactly how much to apply and when to stop. The Ice Age was not a season. It was a long thought the Earth allowed itself to finish. But even the deepest thoughts eventually shift. Somewhere beneath the frozen silence, warmth waited. Not as rescue, as return. And when the planet was ready to remember motion again, the ice would begin to loosen its grip. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the same patience that brought it there. Because what the white hand erased, it never truly removed. It only folded the world into a quieter shape, one that could hold what was coming next. The ice did not need permission to stay. It lingered because the planet allowed it to linger. Beneath the frozen ceiling, the surface learned a different measure of time. One without urgency, one where moments were counted not in days but in pressure. Each meter of ice added another layer of quiet. Sound disappeared first, then movement. Finally, even change learned how to slow itself down. What lay beneath that weight was not empty. It was rearranging. Rock, when pressed long enough, forgets how to be rigid. It bends without bending, fractures without breaking. Minerals align like thoughts settling into agreement. Quartz grains rotate into patience. Feldspar loosens its grip on sharp edges. The crust listens to gravity, the way skin listens to cold by tightening, by holding on. Nothing is wasted. Even stillness has a purpose. Glaciers advanced in motions too slow for fear. A single human lifetime would not notice their passing. 1,000 lifetimes would only sense the aftermath. They flowed not like water, but like memory, dragging fragments of distant places into new contexts. A stone born in a mountain found itself resting hundreds of miles away, polished into smoothness by time alone. The land was learning to travel without moving. As ice thickened, the surface grew blind, soil vanished. Colours faded into a single, reflective silence. Photosynthesis retreated southward, then inward, then down. What could not adapt withdrew into shelter beneath snowbanks, inside rock pores, deep within oceans where warmth still whispered. Life learned compression alongside stone. DNA curled tighter, preserving instructions for a future it could not yet imagine. The planet was not empty. It was conserving breath. Above the ice, the sky changed its behavior. Light scattered differently, bouncing away instead of sinking into ground. Albedo increased, though the planet did not know the word for it. It only felt the feedback: more reflection, more cold, more permission for ice to remain. Climate tightened like a loop, self-reinforcing, self-contained. The Earth was not spiraling. It was stabilizing into cold. Storms crossed frozen plains carrying dust ground from ancient mountains. Fine particles settled onto ice, darkening it in places, marking time the way rings mark trees. Each layer recorded a silence, a wind direction, a distant eruption, a dry season somewhere beyond the white horizon. Ice became an archive, storing not stories, but conditions. It remembered the atmosphere as it was, breath by breath. Beneath the glaciers, the land was being rewritten line by line. Hills flattened into plains, plains folded into basins, drainage patterns vanished, then reappeared elsewhere, reimagined. The planet did not mourn what was lost. It rarely does. It is more interested in what becomes possible. When a river path disappears, 1,000 others wait in potential. Ice teaches choice by removing options. There were moments long, indistinct, when the ice paused its advance. Balance hovered. Cold and warmth negotiated in silence. The glaciers did not rush. They waited for gravity to decide. Then, almost imperceptibly, movement resumed. A few centimeters a year, a few meters in a century. Enough to matter, never enough to hurry. This was how continents were edited. Not with fire, not with impact, but with patience. Fire reshapes quickly and forgets. Ice reshapes slowly and remembers. The difference is written into the land. U-shaped valleys curve like open palms. Moraines sit where motion stopped. Piles of carried thought left behind. Erratic boulders rest far from their origins. Quiet evidence that the world once moved in ways the present cannot feel. Time under ice does not heal, it prepares. Pressure does not comfort, it clarifies. The Earth learned which structures could endure and which would be ground into usefulness. Weakness became soil, strength became framework. From this cold instruction, the future would grow forests, rivers, and eventually mines capable of wondering where valleys came from. But the ice was not eternal. Nothing that rests on the surface ever is. Far below, heat continued its slow ascent. The mantle breathed, seasons shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. A fraction more sunlight lingered each summer. Meltwater traced thin lines along the base of glaciers, lubricating motion, whispering of release. The ice did not resist. It does not cling. It yields when yielding becomes the next correct shape. The white hand began to loosen, not in retreat, but in transition. Melt did not undo the work. It revealed it. As the ice thinned, the land beneath emerged altered, smoothed, rearranged, quieter than before. What had been rewritten was now ready to be read, and as the first waters began to move again, they followed paths taught by absence, guided by spaces the ice had left behind. When the ice began to thin, it did not vanish. It transformed. What had once been a ceiling became a slow rain, a careful return of motion to a surface that had forgotten how to receive it. Meltwater did not rush. It seeped, searching for weaknesses the ice itself had created. Pressure had written new instructions into the rock, and water, patient as memory, followed them without question. At the base of the glaciers, channels formed in darkness. Invisible rivers flowed beneath kilometers of frozen weight, carrying mineral-laden water across distances no surface stream could match. These subglacial paths were not accidents. They were rehearsals. The land was practicing how to move water again. Each drop learned the curve of stone, the pull of gravity, the permission to travel. Long before sunlight returned to the ground, the planet remembered how circulation worked. As melting continued, the ice surface fractured into silence. Crevasses opened like slow thoughts splitting apart. The white field, once unbroken, began to speak in lines and shadows. Light entered where it had not been allowed before. Not warmth yet, just presence. The glaciers responded by shifting, sliding slightly faster, releasing what they had carried for tens of thousands of years. Stones fell free. Dust settled. The archive began to open itself. Where meltwater pooled, temporary lakes formed cold, heavy, unafraid of depth. Some drained suddenly, carving channels in moments that felt abrupt only because they followed ages of stillness. These floods were not violent. They were decisive. The land accepted them without protest, knowing that every rapid change was balanced by the time that preceded it. Even urgency has its place when it arrives after patience. Beyond the ice margins, the world began to stretch. Newly exposed ground lay bare, raw, and unreadable. There was no soil yet, no softness, only rock ground fine enough to someday become fertile. Wind moved across these surfaces, carrying seeds of future ecosystems that did not yet know they would be needed. Lichens would arrive first, but for now, there was only the quiet readiness of stone. As ice retreated poleward and upward, oceans began to remember their volume. Water returned from its frozen holding, lifting sea levels slowly, reshaping coasts into something new. Shorelines migrated without nostalgia. Bays drowned. Plains vanished. New estuaries formed where rivers met rising tides. The ocean did not reclaim what it lost. It accepted what it was given. Memory in water is always flexible. Currents shifted as meltwater altered salinity and temperature. Cold, fresh water slid across denser salt, changing circulation patterns in ways that would echo for millennia. Climate learned new rhythms, not abruptly, but through negotiation. The planet has never favored sudden decisions. It prefers adjustment, feedback, response. Even warming carries the imprint of cold long past. Life, sensing opportunity, began to unfold, not explosively, cautiously. Species expanded ranges that had been compressed into refuges. Forests crept northward and uphill, following soils still forming beneath their roots. Grasslands appeared where dust had settled thick enough to hold moisture. Every ecosystem carried the fingerprint of ice in its layout, its limits, its silences. Nothing returned to where it had been. There is no return after rewriting. The rivers that emerged followed paths carved by absence. Glacial valleys guided flow with broad, gentle slopes. Lakes formed in basins scoured by ice, their shapes echoing the slow curves of pressure. These waters would become mirrors, reflecting skies that had changed their color during the cold. Even now, they would hold the memory of weight in their depth and clarity. Mountains, reduced and rounded, stood differently against the horizon. They no longer pierced the sky with sharp intent. They held it softly, like hands cupping light. Their slopes fed streams with mineral-rich runoff, nourishing landscapes that would one day support countless forms of life. Erosion continued, but now it was guided by water rather than ice, a quieter, more conversational process. The thaw did not erase the ice age. It revealed it. Every polished stone, every misplaced boulder, every wide valley spoke without words of what had passed overhead. The planet did not hide its past. It embedded it into the surface, trusting time to teach future observers how to read it. Understanding would come much later. For now, there was only continuation. Even as warmth spread, cold lingered in shadows, in high places, in memory. Glaciers remained where gravity and latitude allowed, small compared to what had been but persistent, reminders rather than rulers. The Earth does not fully abandon its lessons. It keeps them nearby, folded into climate and stone. And beneath the returning green, beneath the moving water, the land carried the quiet certainty that it had been shaped once by silence and could be again. The land did not celebrate its exposure. It accepted it, newly freed from ice. The surface lay open beneath the sky, like a thought still deciding what it would become. There was no rush to be covered in green. The earth has never mistaken speed for success. It allowed the stone to breathe first, to feel sunlight after tens of thousands of years of reflection and cold. Heat arrived gently, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Cracks formed as rock adjusted to temperature again. Expansion and contraction became teachers. Water slipped into fractures, freezing and thawing in small, patient cycles that continued the work ice had begun. Even without glaciers, cold still shaped the land, quietly, persistently. Erosion does not end when ice retreats. It simply changes its tone. Where glaciers spoke in pressure, frost spoke in repetition. Sediment, once locked in frozen stillness, began its slow migration. Meltwater carried fine particles into streams and lakes, where they settled layer by layer, building archives beneath the surface. Each grain found a place, contributing to a record that would outlast forests and cities yet to come. The planet writes carefully when it expects to be read far in the future. Wind moved differently now. Without towering ice sheets to redirect it, air currents softened, wandered, and learned new routes. Dust traveled shorter distances. Moisture lingered longer. Clouds gathered in unfamiliar ways. Rain learned where to fall again. Climate, released from its frozen restraint, did not return to an earlier state. It formed a new balance, informed by what it had endured. In these shifting conditions, life resumed its quiet expansion, not with triumph, with caution. Seeds took hold in mineral-rich ground, left behind by ice, soil still young and thin. Roots explored cautiously, encountering stones smoothed into gentleness. Fungi spread beneath the surface, knitting together what pressure had separated. Networks formed long before forests appeared. Intelligence began again, not as thought, but as connection. Animals followed corridors shaped by ice. Valleys guided movement. Passes lowered by erosion allowed migration where none had been possible before. Species redistributed themselves across continents, reshaped into invitation rather than barrier. What the ice had flattened, life crossed. What it had carved, life followed. Geography became guidance. Lakes, abundant and still, held the sky without distortion. Their waters were cold, clear, carrying the memory of compression in their density. Beneath their surfaces, chemistry continued its slow experiments. Oxygen dissolved differently. Nutrients settled into patterns that would define productivity for ages. These bodies of water were not accidents. They were punctuation marks left by retreating ice, pauses in the land where reflection could gather. Farther north and higher up, remnants of the great cold remained. Glaciers clung to mountains like unfinished sentences. They moved still, though more slowly now, reminding the planet of a language it once spoke fluently. Their melt-fed rivers that never forgot where their strength came from. Even diminished, ice continued to instruct. The surface of the earth, rewritten by absence, carried a quiet coherence. Nothing was random. Even chaos left patterns when given enough time. Plains stretched where ice had pressed longest. Hills rose where deposits accumulated. Coastlines curved in response to rising seas that filled basins carved by weight. Every contour was a response, an answer to pressure that no longer existed. Time resumed its forward drift, but it carried depth now. The land remembered how it felt to be held. That memory altered how it responded to everything that followed. Rain, wind, warmth, even fire. Fire would come later, reshaping ecosystems built on glacial foundations. Intelligence would come later still, trying to read the ground beneath its feet. The Ice Age did not prepare the Earth for a specific future. It prepared it for change itself. Nothing about the rewritten surface was permanent. The planet does not believe in permanence. It believes in process. What ice had smoothed, water would carve again. What pressure had lowered, tectonics would eventually raise. But the pace had changed. The rhythms were slower now, broader, more forgiving. Ice had taught the Earth how to move without breaking itself. And so the great cold faded not into memory, but into structure. It lived on in valleys too wide for their rivers, in soils too rich for their youth, in coastlines shaped by seas that rose in quiet response. The planet carried the ice within itself, not as burden, but as blueprint. Because what rewrites the world most deeply is not what arrives loudly, but what stays long enough to teach the surface how to endure. Long after the last great sheets of ice had loosened their grip, the planet continued to behave as if the cold were still nearby. Memory does not vanish when the weight is gone. It lingers in posture, in response, in the way stone expects pressure even when none arrives. The Earth had learned restraint. It had learned how to hold stillness inside motion. Rivers, now fully awake, did not rush to cut sharply into the land. They wandered. Their valleys were already wide, already shaped by something far slower than water. Flow became a conversation rather than a command. Floodplains spread gently, depositing fine sediments left behind by glaciers that no longer existed. These layers became invitations, thin, fertile skins where life could settle without fear of sudden loss. The ice had lowered the volume of catastrophe. In places where glaciers once stalled, the land bore ridges of debris, stones, and soil carried from far away, then abandoned without ceremony. These moraines were not obstacles, they were pauses. Water pooled against them. Wetlands formed. Marshes learned how to breathe between land and liquid. Amphibious life would later find refuge here, but for now, the planet simply enjoyed the balance. Neither dry nor drowned, neither moving nor still. The atmosphere, too, carried the echo of cold. Carbon moved differently after ice. Gases exchanged between ocean and sky with altered timing. Breath patterns changed. Seasons softened their extremes, not because the planet had grown gentle, but because it had learned modulation. Ice ages do not end with forgetting. They end with recalibration. In high latitudes, where sunlight returned hesitantly, ecosystems assembled themselves slowly. Mosses spread like whispered agreements across stone. Tundra followed, sparse but resilient. Trees waited longer, listening for stability. Roots do not trust quickly. They remember what pressure can do. When forests finally advanced, they did so in waves, retreating and returning as climate tested its new equilibrium. Growth was not linear. It never is. After deep interruption, elsewhere, grasslands expanded across plains flattened by ice. These open spaces were not empty. They were dynamic, responsive, capable of adapting to shifts in rainfall and temperature. Fire would eventually move through them, but fire here behaved differently. guided by landscapes already simplified by cold. Even destruction learned a softer language when shaped by earlier patience. The surface of the earth, rewritten by ice, had become legible in a new way. Slopes directed water with clarity, basins collected it with generosity. Mountains no longer dictated weather as sharply as before. Wind patterns adjusted, learning to flow around rounded forms rather than colliding with sharp edges. The planet had been sanded down, not into sameness, but into coherence. Deep below, the crust continued its slow movement, unconcerned with surface climates. But even tectonics responded indirectly. Ice had removed weight from continents, allowing them to rise imperceptibly, rebounding from long compression. Land lifted itself millimetre by millimetre, like a body stretching after long rest. This motion, too slow to feel, reshaped coastlines again, altering drainage, extending shorelines, confusing any simple idea of an ending. Nothing returned to how it had been before the cold. There was no before to return to. Ice ages erase the possibility of nostalgia. They leave behind landscapes that remember pressure better than they remember warmth. In these terrains, life learned flexibility. Species evolved not toward dominance, but toward responsiveness. Survival favored those who could pause, retreat, and wait without despair. Much later, far later than the land itself, minds would appear capable of noticing these shapes. They would wonder why valleys were so wide, why lakes sat where no rivers seemed strong enough to carve them, why stones from distant places rested inexplicably on familiar ground. They would give names to what ice had done. They would measure and date and explain, but explanation would never fully capture the feeling of weight the land still held, because beneath every measurement lay something quieter, an understanding not spoken aloud, that the surface of the world is not written by intention, but by endurance, that what shapes most deeply does not arrive with noise or heat or speed. It arrives slowly. It stays. It presses until the planet changes its mind about what it can become. The ice ages did not merely rewrite Earth's surface. They rewrote Earth's patience. They taught the planet how to survive extremes by becoming something else entirely. And even now, in every softened hill and wandering river, that lesson remains unspoken, intact, waiting. For what was shaped by long silence never forgets how to listen. The cold, though diminished, never truly departed. It learned how to disguise itself. It settled into latitude, into elevation, into the quiet mathematics of orbit and tilt. The planet carried ice forward not as surface, but as memory folded into climate. Seasons inherited that memory without knowing its source. Winters lingered where glaciers once ruled. Summers hesitated where pressure had taught restraint. Nothing forgot. It simply learned how to express itself differently. In the oceans, the legacy of ice moved like a second tide. Meltwater had altered circulation long after the last sheets withdrew, redirecting currents with subtle insistence. Warmth travelled along new paths. Cold sank where it had learned to belong. The deep sea absorbed these lessons patiently, layering temperature and salt into stratified silence. Down there, time did not flow. It rested. Marine life adapted to gradients shaped by ancient cold, evolving in response to conditions written thousands of years before their arrival. On land, the surface continued to soften. Weathering replaced erosion. Rain fell into soils young enough to still remember stone. Nutrients moved slowly, cautiously, teaching ecosystems how to be efficient. Forests that grew on glacial ground tended toward cooperation rather than competition. Their roots intertwined, their canopies shared light. The planet had learned, through cold, that excess was fragile, balance endured longer. Ice ages also taught the Earth how to reset without collapse. When climates shifted again, and they always do, the land responded with flexibility. Rivers changed course without tearing themselves apart. Species migrated rather than vanished. Extinction still occurred, but it arrived quietly, like a story ending between chapters rather than mid-sentence. The surface had been trained to absorb loss. Even fire, when it came, behaved with a different memory beneath it. Burned scars followed contours left by ice. Regrowth mirrored the soil patterns glaciers had arranged long ago. Destruction revealed structure rather than chaos. The planet had learned how to let go without unraveling. In the far north and south, ice returned again and again, never as vast as before, but persistent enough to remind the world of its deeper rhythms. These cycles were not repetitions. Each return wrote over an already edited page, adding nuance rather than erasure. The Earth does not repeat itself, it revises. What remained constant was patience. The land no longer hurried to extremes. It had learned how long change could take and still be effective. It had learned that pressure, applied gently and continuously, could reshape even mountains. That silence, given time, could rewrite an entire surface. The memory of ice settled into the very idea of landscape. Hills became less about height and more about slope, valleys about passage rather than depth, coasts about transition instead of boundary. The planet had been taught how to blur edges, how to soften definitions, how to prepare space for life that would eventually need room to wander. Far in the future, when intelligence began to look outward and backward at the same time, it would find these patterns everywhere. It would build paths along glacial corridors. It would settle near lakes left behind by retreating cold. It would grow food in soils enriched by stone ground fine under pressure. Without knowing it, thought itself would be shaped by ice, by landscapes that encouraged movement, reflection, and return. Because the surface we walk upon is not merely ground, it is instruction, a record of how the planet survived its most complete silences, a reminder that what seems empty is often preparing, that what withdraws may be making room. That cold, when given enough time, does not destroy, it reorganizes, and somewhere beneath the warmth of the present, beneath forests, cities, and names, the Earth still carries the outline of ice, not as threat, but as memory waiting patiently for the next long breath. The ocean did not notice the ice at first. It rarely notices anything immediately. Water responds slowly, as if each adjustment must pass through depth before becoming surface. But as snow accumulated on land, as glaciers learned how to stay, something subtle began to change. The sea felt lighter, not emotionally, physically. Its volume thinned, molecule by molecule, as water was lifted from circulation and stored in cold silence elsewhere. Coastlines began to drift without ceremony. The ocean stepped back, not as retreat, but as redistribution. Bays narrowed. Continental shelves emerged like thoughts returning from sleep. What had been shallow became land again, though land without history. These exposed surfaces did not remember forests or waves. They waited, bare and undecided, listening for what would claim them next. The sea did not mourn what it lost. Water does not grieve the way stone does. It adapts. As its level lowered, its chemistry shifted inward. Salt concentrated. Density changed. The ocean grew heavier within itself, even as it shrank along the margins. This internal tightening altered how currents moved, how warmth travelled from equator to pole. The planet did not feel colder everywhere. It felt rearranged. Beneath the forming ice shelves, in darkness untouched by sunlight, circulation continued. Deep currents slid beneath frozen roofs, carrying faint warmth through pressure alone. These movements were not fast enough to melt ice, but they were enough to prevent forgetting. The ocean remained awake beneath the cold, keeping time in slow loops that spanned entire ice ages. Where the surface slept, the depths remembered motion. As water retreated, pathways opened between continents. Land bridges rose where seas had once rested, not as sudden connections, but as gradual revelations. The planet did not announce these passages. It allowed them. Earth learned how to offer routes without promising permanence. These corridors would matter later. For now, they were simply exposed silence, stretches of ground that had once known weight and now felt air again. The ocean adjusted its breath. With less surface area exchanging gases, carbon lingered differently between sky and sea. Oxygen dissolved with altered rhythm. These changes did not declare themselves. They folded quietly into the planet's balance, influencing climate in ways too slow to notice, too steady to ignore. Water teaches the Earth how to change without appearing to do so. Ice at the poles extended into the sea, forming shelves that floated and cracked with patient inevitability. These frozen margins were not solid land. They were negotiations between states, liquid remembering solid, solid remembering flow. When pieces broke free, they drifted without destination, carrying cold far from its source. The ocean accepted them, melting them slowly, absorbing their instruction drop by drop. Life adapted without urgency. Marine organisms shifted ranges, following temperature gradients that slid beneath the surface like invisible slopes. Some retreated deeper, others closer to equatorial warmth. Extinction occurred, but not dramatically. It arrived as absence rather than event, leaving gaps that water filled easily. In the ocean, loss does not leave scars, it leaves space. Sediments settled differently now. With sea levels lower, rivers delivered minerals farther into exposed basins, laying down layers that would later be submerged again. These deposits carried the fingerprint of ice fine, ground material produced by pressure rather than weather. The ocean floor became a quiet ledger of land's long, cold labour. Time in the sea does not pass forward, it circulates. The ice ages did not interrupt that circulation. They altered its route. Even as the surface withdrew, the deep maintained its rhythm, storing heat, carbon, and memory until conditions allowed their return. The ocean does not forget what it holds. It waits. And so the sea learned how to exist without edges, without fixed borders, without certainty. It became a body defined not by where it ended, but by how it moved when asked to change. As the oceans withdrew, they did not empty. They deepened. What was lost along the margins gathered inward, thickening the interior of the sea like a thought becoming more focused the longer it remains unspoken. Pressure increased in the depths. Temperature gradients sharpened. The ocean grew more stratified, more layered, holding its memories in stacked silence. Where sunlight once reached shallow floors, darkness settled again. These newly exposed shelves, briefly land, felt the strangeness of air, wind brushing surfaces shaped for water, salt crystallizing where waves no longer passed. But farther out, beyond the reach of retreat, the deep sea continued its long listening. Down there, nothing had changed abruptly enough to be called change. Currents still traced their ancient loops, guided by gravity and density rather than season or sky. Ice shelves pressed outward from continents like slow exhalations, extending the land's cold into the water. Beneath them, the ocean learned how to move in constraint. Narrow corridors of liquid slid between ice and seabed, carrying heat in thin, careful streams. This warmth did not announce itself. It did not challenge the cold. It simply existed, preserving motion, where stillness seemed absolute. The planet kept breathing underwater. Salt became a quiet architect. As fresh water locked into ice, salinity rose, altering buoyancy and flow. Heavier water sank more readily, dragging oxygen and nutrients into the depths. Life followed these shifts instinctively, without language, without plan. Organisms adapted not to ice itself, but to the consequences of its patience. Bodies changed shape, metabolism slowed, reproduction waited for moments of brief generosity in an otherwise restrained world. Above, the surface of the sea mirrored the sky less often. Ice and cloud blurred the boundary between water and air, reflecting pale light back upward. The ocean's face grew quieter, less expressive. Storms still crossed it, but their energy redistributed, their impact softened by altered temperature contrasts. Even turbulence learned restraint under the long influence of cold. Rivers, freed from glacial confinement, carried their histories outward. They delivered sediments ground fine under kilometers of ice, pouring them into basins now far from the old shorelines. Deltas formed where water slowed, building land from memory. These structures were temporary, but they mattered. They were the planet's way of practicing return, of preparing spaces where the sea would one day come back without surprise. The falling sea level exposed not just land, but time. Ancient terraces emerged, steps cut by earlier oceans during earlier silences. The planet revealed that this had happened before. That water had left and returned many times, each departure rewriting the surface slightly differently. The Ice Age was not unique. It was another verse in a song too slow to recognize as repetition. In the deep, sound travelled farther than light. Whales did not yet sing, but the water already knew how to carry vibration across vast distances. Tectonic murmurs, distant carving ice, the low groan of shifting shelves, these became the ocean's language. It listened to the land above it changing weight, adjusting its own posture in response. Even water feels gravity's stories. As millennia passed, the balance between ocean and ice stabilized into a long stillness. Sea levels hovered low, coastlines paused, currents settled into predictable paths. This equilibrium was not fragile, it was deliberate. The planet had found a configuration that could last. In that duration, life refined its patience. Ecosystems leaned into endurance rather than abundance. And the sea learned how to hold absence without collapsing inward. When warming eventually returned, the ocean would respond as it always does, slowly, thoroughly, without attachment to what it had been. But for now, it rested in its reduced form, carrying the weight of ice indirectly, through chemistry and motion rather than shape. It did not wait eagerly, it simply remained capable, because the ocean does not define itself by volume or boundary. It defines itself by circulation, by the ability to move, even when confined, by the grace of adjusting without forgetting, and beneath the lowered tides, beneath the exposed shelves and silent corridors, the sea held space for its own return, knowing that when the ice finally released its breath, water would rise again, not to reclaim the past, but to redraw the edges once more. When the return began, it did not announce itself as warming. It arrived as hesitation. A longer summer lingered at the margins, ice shelves thinned by fractions too small to name. The ocean felt these changes first, not at the surface, but in its interior, where temperature shifts translate slowly into movement. Density altered its balance. Layers leaned toward one another. Circulation adjusted its posture, preparing for a change it did not yet understand. Fresh water began to seep back into the sea, released from its frozen holding with care rather than collapse. Each drop carried the memory of pressure, of silence, of weight. As meltwater spread across saltier depths, it floated briefly, forming lenses of difference that reshaped surface circulation. These thin skins of contrast-guided winds influenced clouds, redirected storms. The ocean does not command the sky. It suggests. Coastlines responded without resistance. As water levels rose, the sea did not reclaim land. It accepted it. Low plains submerged gradually, soils dissolving back into suspension, minerals returning to motion. Rivers shortened their journeys, meeting the ocean sooner, delivering less sediment than before. Deltas shifted, retreated, reformed elsewhere. The planet did not mourn the loss of exposed ground. It recognized the exchange. Nothing was taken. It was simply placed differently. The newly drowned shelves carried with them the imprint of cold. Their sediments were rich, finely ground, layered with the patience of ice. As they slipped beneath waves once more, they fed blooms of life tuned to abundance after restraint. Plankton flourished where nutrients surfaced from glacial grinding. Food webs thickened, then stabilized, learning how to distribute plenty without forgetting scarcity. Currents, altered by the slow pulse of fresh water and heat, found new paths. Some strengthened, others weakened and vanished. The deep ocean absorbed these revisions with composure, storing warmth where it could not easily escape. This quiet hoarding would matter later, shaping climates far from any coast. The sea became not just a responder to change, but a moderator softening extremes, delaying consequences, carrying memory forward in its depth. Ice shelves fractured more frequently now, releasing large pieces that drifted southward like messages from another age. These icebergs melted slowly, extending the influence of cold far beyond its source. They cooled surface waters, altered salinity locally, shaped ecosystems temporarily before dissolving entirely. Even disappearance had an afterimage. Even melting taught. Marine life adapted again, this time toward expansion rather than retreat. Species followed warming currents poleward. Habitats shifted without hurry. Coral reefs would not yet form in many places, but the foundations were being prepared, chemistry aligning, temperatures settling into ranges that could one day support complexity. The ocean was not racing toward richness. It was arranging conditions for it. Sound changed as well. As ice diminished, the sea's acoustic landscape softened. The constant grinding, the distant cracking, the low thunder of calving became less frequent. Silence returned, but it was a different silence than before. Not compressed, open, the kind that allows listening outward rather than inward. The ocean does not prefer quiet or noise. It adjusts to both. Above, the sky reflected differently off water now free from constant ice cover. Light penetrated deeper, warming upper layers, feeding photosynthesis. Color returned gradually, blues and greens reasserting themselves after long pallor. The sea's surface became expressive again, rippling with wind, responding to passing weather. Yet beneath that motion, the deep remained composed, carrying the slow rhythms learned during cold. The ocean never returned to its former edges. There was no former to return to. Each rise rewrote the map, drowning some memories and revealing others through erosion and redeposition. Coastlines are not lines. They are conversations between water and land, renegotiated endlessly. Ice ages simply lengthen the pause between replies. What the sea gained from the long cold was not caution, but flexibility. It learned how to exist in reduced form without collapsing, how to expand without aggression, how to change its shape while keeping its motion intact. These lessons would echo through every future climate shift, every rise and fall yet to come. Because the ocean does not measure time by calendars or ages. It measures it by depth, by how long something can be held before it must be released, by how patiently return can be delayed without being denied. And as the water rose once more, redrawing coasts and softening borders, it did not forget the moment it had stepped back. It carried that memory forward, knowing that edges are temporary and movement is the only promise it ever keeps. As the ocean expanded, it did not surge. It seeped. Water has no interest in spectacle. It prefers inevitability. Inch by inch, it rose along coastlines, shaped long ago by ice, filling curves that had been waiting patiently for their return. What had once been land slipped beneath the surface without resistance, dissolving back into circulation as if it had never learned to be solid at all. The memory of cold remained suspended in the water. Even as temperatures climbed, layers of the sea held onto their histories. Warmth settled on top, cold stayed below. Between them, boundaries formed that guided life, light, and sound. These invisible divisions were not walls. They were agreements, quiet, understandings about where things could move and how fast. The ocean learned how to keep multiple pasts alive at once. Currents braided themselves through these layers, stitching together distances that seemed impossible on the surface. Heat traveled north without announcing its journey. Nutrients rose from the deep in slow spirals, feeding regions far from their source. The ocean became a memory engine, redistributing what had been taken away, smoothing the contrast between then and now. It did not restore balance. It redefined it. In places where glaciers had once reached the sea, fjords remained long, narrow inlets holding shadows even at noon. These were not scars. They were quiet spaces where salt and fresh water met carefully, where stratification was visible to the eye. Life gathered here in layered abundance, species occupying precise depths as if following an unspoken script. Ice had taught the ocean how to organize complexity without noise. Farther out, continental shelves once exposed now lay submerged beneath shallow seas. Sunlight reached them easily, igniting productivity built on sediments ground fine by ancient pressure. These regions became nurseries, places where abundance did not overwhelm because it had been shaped by restraint. The ocean remembered what it was like to be reduced, and so it did not overfill itself. The soundscape continued to soften. With fewer ice shelves pressing outward, the low-frequency murmurs faded. What remained was motion itself, the sigh of waves, the slow shifting of currents, the distant conversation between water masses, exchanging heat and salt. Silence did not mean emptiness. It meant stability, a space where change could occur without alarm. Time moved differently now, not faster, just less compressed. The ocean released what it had been holding: carbon, heat, motion, but it did so gradually, as if aware that sudden generosity could undo the patience it had practiced for so long. This restraint would shape climates on land, softening transitions, delaying extremes. The sea became a mediator, carrying the memory of ice into a warmer world as guidance rather than warning. Life continued its careful expansion. Species followed isotherms as they shifted, migrating along pathways the ocean made available without direction. There was no rush to reclaim everything at once. Diversity returned in patterns shaped by currents rather than coasts, by depth rather than distance. The sea does not organize itself around edges. It organizes itself around flow. Even now, long after the ice had thinned into memory, the ocean carried its influence in posture and pace. It remembered how it felt to shrink. That knowledge altered how it expanded. It remembered absence. That knowledge altered how it held presence. Nothing about the sea's movement was accidental. Every adjustment echoed a long conversation with cold. And so the ocean settled into its new shape, not final, never final, but momentarily complete. Edges drawn lightly, depths holding stories, motion continuing without urgency. The water did not ask whether the ice would return. It already knew the answer, folded into orbit, and tilt and time beyond naming. Because the ocean does not fear change, it expects it. It prepares for it by learning how to become smaller, so that becoming larger will not break it. And beneath the rising tides, beneath the softened coasts and deepening blues, the sea kept one truth intact, that withdrawal is not loss, and return is never repetition. The mountains once believed the sky belonged to them. They rose with edges sharp enough to catch light and tear wind into sound. Their faces were angular, unsoftened, speaking loudly of height and endurance. In those early shapes, there was confidence, an assumption that standing tall was the same as lasting forever. The planet did not disagree. It simply waited. Ice never challenged the peaks directly. It gathered lower, where gravity welcomed it, where valleys made space for weight. Snow fell and stayed. Seasons failed to remove it. Layer pressed upon layer until light was squeezed out and time thickened into mass. The cold did not announce its intention. It did not need to. Presence was enough. As glaciers were born, they learned the shape of the land before the land understood what was happening. They followed slopes patiently, filling hollows, resting against rock with a pressure that did not bruise but persuaded. Stone, when leaned on long enough, forgets how to resist. Fractures formed not with sound, but with surrender. Strength became flexible. Rigidity softened into yield. The mountains felt this first as silence, a deep internal quiet where stress redistributed itself without drama. Peaks did not snap. They loosened, corners rounded, edges dulled as ice carried fragments away, not in theft, but in relocation. What left the summit did not vanish. It travelled downward, becoming part of valleys, plains, and future ground. Height began to dissolve into distance. What had once been vertical ambition spread outward, thinning itself across landscapes that would one day hold forests, rivers, and paths. The mountains were not being erased. They were being taught another way to exist. Ice does not destroy elevation. It teaches it how to kneel. With each slow advance and retreat, glaciers repeated their lesson. Over and over, they moved the same way, pressed the same places, returned to the same weaknesses, until weakness became transformation. Repetition replaced intention, time replaced force. This was intelligence without thought design emerging from patience alone. Ridges lost their voices. Their sharp declarations quieted into long, readable slopes. Valleys widened into open hands, capable of holding water, soil, and later, life. The land grew legible. One could follow its curves without fear of sudden drop or rupture. The surface began to invite rather than command. Stone ground against stone, until it became dust fine enough to remember moisture. This powder did not announce its future, but it carried it. Someday it would become soil. Someday roots would recognize it as home. The mountains were not ending. They were translating themselves into something that could grow. Even now, beneath the pressure, the planet did not hurry. It allowed the process to take as long as it needed. Millions of years passed like breath held gently, then released. Ice came and went again, each time lowering the land not into defeat, but into readiness. The tallest structures learned what endurance actually meant, not standing above everything, but allowing oneself to be reshaped without breaking. And as the mountains leaned lower into the world, they became quieter, and in that quiet, they became useful. The kneeling did not happen all at once. It unfolded in increments too small for urgency. A ridge would soften by a fraction. A peak would lose a sliver of height so slight it could only be noticed by time itself. Ice does not rush the lesson. It repeats it, again and again, until resistance forgets its own shape. As glaciers pressed forward, they carried with them the memory of higher ground. Stones torn from summits were dragged along the ice's underside, grinding against bedrock with a steadiness that bordered on gentleness. This was not carving by strike, but by contact. The land was not cut. It was worn into understanding. Each pass smoothed what remained, lowering complexity into coherence. The mountains began to feel wider than they were tall. Their identity shifted from height to spread, from singular peaks to connected forms. Ranges became systems rather than statements. Ice moved through them like a thought passing repeatedly through the same idea, refining it each time, removing excess until only what could endure remained. In places where glaciers stalled, pressure lingered longest. These pauses mattered. The land beneath them learned endurance through stillness. Rock compressed. Minerals rearranged their bonds. Structures deep within the crust aligned themselves with gravity's insistence. This was not erosion visible to the eye. It was erosion of posture, of internal arrangement, of the mountain's belief in its own immovability. Water joined the lesson quietly. Melt crept into fractures, froze, expanded, then released again. This cycle did not shatter the rock. It reminded it. Over and over, the same gesture repeated until even the strongest faces loosened their grip. Frost did not attack. It conversed. And stone, given enough time, always answers. The highest peaks remained longest, but even they learned restraint. Their summits dulled, their profiles softened against the sky. They stopped declaring themselves and began to blend into horizon. Height became suggestion rather than command. The sky no longer had to bend around them. Light moved more freely. Wind flowed without tearing. What fell from the mountains did not disappear. Debris collected at their feet, forming aprons of broken material that slowly spread outward. These deposits carried the mountain's history in fragments, each grain once part of something higher, now contributing to something broader. Plains began here, not as emptiness, but as inheritance. Rivers followed these newly shaped slopes with ease. Water prefers cooperation. It traced paths already taught by ice, widening valleys further, continuing the work in a different language. What glaciers began in silence, rivers continued in motion. The lesson remained the same. Shape is not fixed, it is negotiated. Over time, the mountains became less dramatic, but more generous. Their lowered forms held snow longer without collapsing into avalanche. Their gentler slopes caught rain and released it slowly. They fed landscapes instead of intimidating them. This was not decline, it was maturity. Ice ages came and went, each cycle revisiting the same structures, reinforcing the same instruction. Repetition is how the planet teaches itself, not through sudden correction, but through persistent presence. What resisted learned flexibility. What broke became material for something else. Nothing was wasted. The land grew readable in its quietness. One could trace where ice had lingered longest by the smoothness of stone, the breadth of valleys, the fine texture of soil beginning to form. These were not scars, they were signatures, evidence of patience, applied consistently enough to reshape even the tallest forms. Mountains that once reached upward learned how to settle downward without losing themselves. They became places of passage rather than barriers, of nourishment rather than defiance. Their silence deepened, and in that silence they began preparing for life they would never witness directly. Because the greatest strength the land ever learned was not how to stand forever, but how to lower itself, so that something else could rise. As the mountains lowered, they began to change how they held time. Sharp peaks experienced time as exposure, wind tearing past, ice striking and leaving. But softened ranges experience time as accumulation. Snow rests longer. Rain seeps instead of runs. The land learned how to keep what arrived, rather than deflect it. This was another form of humility, quieter than erosion, but deeper. Pressure had altered the surface, but repetition altered the interior. Within the rock, crystals realigned, stress redistributed itself into patterns that no longer fought gravity. The mountains no longer resisted their own weight. They cooperated with it. This cooperation made them stable in a new way, less dramatic, more enduring. Height had once promised permanence. Yield now delivered it. Ice taught the land how to be continuous. Where once jagged ridges interrupted movement, broad passes emerged. These were not designed. They were remembered into existence through repetition. Each glacial cycle returned to the same weaknesses, the same seams, until passage became inevitable. The mountains did not open doors. They relaxed their grip. In these newly gentle corridors, air moved differently. Wind no longer screamed. It flowed. Weather patterns softened, stretching themselves across regions instead of colliding abruptly. Clouds lingered. Snow fell more evenly. The mountains stopped commanding the atmosphere and began participating in it. They became listeners instead of speakers. Stone continued to become smaller, not through violence, but through attention. Each grain that broke away carried the shape of pressure within it. Dust settled into hollows, into low places that held moisture. These fine particles were not lifeless. They were unfinished. They waited for chemistry to wake them, for water to teach them how to bind. Soil begins this way, not as fertility, but as patience. Below the surface, roots would one day follow paths ice had traced long before plants existed. Fractures widened by frost became channels for life. Minerals exposed by erosion became nutrients without knowing why. The mountains were not preparing intentionally. Preparation is simply what happens when something endures long enough to be reused. Rivers deepened their conversations with the land. They did not cut recklessly. They followed gradients already lowered by ice, reinforcing the lesson rather than undoing it. Water respects work done slowly. It does not try to correct it. Valleys widened further, becoming spaces where movement felt natural rather than forced. The idea of a mountain shifted. It was no longer an obstacle. It became a reservoir. Snowmelt fed rivers steadily instead of catastrophically. Rain lingered. Springs emerged where pressure had fractured stone just enough to allow release. The mountains learned how to give without collapsing. Even erosion changed character. Without sharp relief, gravity lost its impatience. Landslides became rare. Collapse gave way to settling. The land found equilibrium not by resisting motion, but by distributing it. This distribution was the true kneeling, not submission, but balance. Over immense spans of time, ranges that had once dominated continents blended into plateaus, into rolling highlands, barely distinguishable from plains. Their identity survived, not in height, but in contribution. They fed ecosystems, shaped climates, guided water. Their silence became structural. Ice had taught them this by staying, by returning, by never raising its voice. The lesson was not that nothing lasts, but that what lasts does not insist on being seen. The mountains did not disappear. They became readable, and, in becoming readable, they became useful to everything that followed. As the land softened, it began to remember water differently. Snow no longer fled the slopes at the first hint of warmth. It lingered, melting slowly, releasing itself in measured offerings rather than sudden loss. Streams learned steadiness. Springs found time. The mountains had learned how to hold before they learned how to give. This change altered the language of weather. Storms arrived and passed without tearing the surface apart. Rain entered the ground instead of racing across it. The land absorbed more than it rejected. In this absorption, something subtle took place. The mountains began to participate in cycles rather than interrupt them. They no longer stood apart from the systems moving across them. They became part of circulation. Pressure had rewritten the stone, but humility rewrote behavior. Where cliffs once shed rock with impatience, slopes now released grains gently. Movement became granular, not catastrophic. Erosion lost its sharpness. Time replaced urgency as the primary force. The land learned that letting go slowly preserved more than clinging ever could. Soil deepened almost without notice. It gathered in pockets and basins shaped by ice long gone, binding minerals into combinations that could hold moisture and memory. This soil did not announce fertility, it prepared it. Microbes arrived first, invisible, stitching chemistry into readiness. Life always enters quietly, where patience has already done the work. The mountains began to function as archives rather than monuments. Their layers, once vertical proclamations, now lay angled and folded, readable to those who would one day learn how to listen. Each stratum held evidence of compression, of removal, of return. These records were not meant to be decoded quickly. They were meant to endure long enough to be asked. Paths emerged where ice had passed most often. These routes did not belong to any one species. They were invitations. Wind followed them, water followed them. Later, much later, movement of another kind would follow them too, guided without knowing why. The mountains did not direct. They suggested. As height diminished, influence expanded. The lowered land affected climates far beyond its outline. It moderated temperature, guided rainfall, shaped the flow of rivers that carried its memory outward. Kneeling did not make the mountains smaller, it made them more present. Their reach increased as their profile softened. What once defined them, summits, ridges, dramatic contrasts, became secondary. What mattered now was continuity. The ability to connect one place to another without rupture, the ability to sustain motion without collapse. This was the true lesson ice had taught. Not how to endure pressure, but how to distribute it. Even silence changed. The quiet of sharp peaks is brittle, easily broken by wind and fall. The quiet of rounded land is deep. It absorbs sound. It holds it briefly, then releases it unchanged. In this quiet, the planet practiced listening to itself, sensing adjustments before they became problems. Nothing about this transformation was final. The Earth does not complete chapters, it layers them. But by the time the ice receded for the last time in this long cycle, the mountains had already learned what they needed. They had learned that permanence does not come from standing apart. It comes from becoming useful to what moves around and through you. The kneeling was complete, not when the mountains were low, but when they no longer needed to be high. And as they settled into this new posture, they prepared the surface for what would come next. Not by commanding the future, but by making room for it. The final lowering was almost imperceptible. Not a collapse, not a surrender, just a settling, like a long-held breath finally allowed to rest. The mountains did not notice the moment it happened, neither did the sky. But the land knew. Something had finished rearranging itself. What remained was not small, it was stable. Broad-backed highlands stretched where once sharp summits had insisted on attention. Their forms invited movement rather than defied it. Water crossed them without fear. Wind travelled without harm. Snow rested, melted, returned again without violence. The mountains had become spaces where cycles could pass through without breaking. In their stone, the memory of pressure remained. Every grain still carried the knowledge of weight, but that memory no longer demanded expression through height. It lived quietly in structure, in strength that did not need display. The land had learned that visibility is not endurance, balance is. Below the surface, the finest dust gathered into soils thick enough to hold roots, thin enough to remember stone. This soil did not belong to the mountains anymore. It had become something else, language for growth, a medium through which life would translate mineral into leaf, silence into breath. The mountains had spoken themselves into something living by becoming quiet. Ice had long since withdrawn, but its teachings stayed embedded. Valleys remained wide, forgiving. Slopes remained gentle, capable of absorbing rain rather than shedding it. Rivers followed paths of least resistance, not because they were forced, but because the land had already agreed. This agreement was the final shape of kneeling, not submission, but alignment. Nothing about the mountains asked to be admired anymore. They asked to be crossed, watered, rooted into. They existed not as destinations but as continuities. Their presence was felt in everything that moved across them, even when they themselves went unnoticed. This is how the planet prefers its most important work to appear. Time continued, as it always does, layering warmth over cold memory, vegetation over stone instruction. New forces would arrive: fire, rain, movement of another kind, but they would inherit a surface already trained to endure. The mountains had made the future easier without knowing it, and so their story did not end in disappearance. It ended in diffusion, in becoming part of everything else. Height redistributed into nourishment, pressure into patience, stone into possibility. What once reached upward learned how to spread outward. What once spoke loudly learned how to listen. And in that listening, the land became ready for intelligence that would one day mistake itself as new. But what followed would walk on ground already taught by ice, already softened, already prepared, because the planet does not raise its most important lessons high. It presses them slowly into the surface until they can be felt everywhere. Life did not leave when the cold arrived. It folded itself inward. As ice sealed the surface and light grew distant, living things learned a quieter posture. Growth was no longer the goal, continuation was. The planet did not become empty, it became interior. Beneath frozen ground, beneath oceans capped with cold silence, chemistry continued its slow breathing. Heat lingered where stone met stone, where pressure opened small permissions for warmth to remain. These spaces were not shelters in the way fear imagines them. They were continuities. Places where motion never stopped, only softened enough to wait. In the deep ocean, far below the reach of ice, water stayed liquid and patient. Currents still moved, guided by gravity rather than season. Near the seafloor, vents released warmth that never noticed the cold above. Minerals dissolved, molecules rearranged themselves in darkness. Life there did not rush to change. It refined its ability to remain. Above, the sky stayed pale. Light reflected off ice and cloud, rarely penetrating deeply. Days passed without clarity. Nights stretched without darkness. The surface learned monotony, but beneath that monotony, something vital persisted. Cells divided slowly. Metabolism lowered its voice. Energy was conserved, not spent. Biology entered a long sentence without punctuation. Species did not advance toward complexity during this time. They practiced restraint. Traits that required abundance fell silent. Traits that favored endurance remained. This was not evolution as ascent. It was evolution as stillness. DNA held its instructions tightly, like stories not meant to be told yet. Possibility was preserved, not performed. In sediments beneath ice-covered seas, microbes lived between grains of stone. They fed on chemistry alone, indifferent to the absence of sun. Their existence was not dramatic enough to be noticed by the surface world, but it was enough to keep memory alive, enough to prevent forgetting from becoming extinction. Roots of future life reached backward through time into these moments of quiet survival. Not as direct ancestors, but as rehearsals. The planet was practicing how to keep something alive without expressing it fully. Waiting became an inherited skill. Under frozen continents, pressure created thin films of liquid water along rock boundaries. In these microscopic spaces, life found continuity, not comfort, just persistence. Cells adapted to darkness, to cold, to scarcity. They learned efficiency as a form of intelligence. Waste was reduced, movement slowed, error became expensive, precision became survival. The ice above did not threaten these interiors. It protected them from noise, from fluctuation, from the distraction of change. The long cold created a stable silence, and within that silence, life learned how to be patient without despair. The planet itself seemed to sleep, but it was not unconscious. It was conserving, holding patterns steady, letting surface chaos pause while interior rhythms continued uninterrupted. This was not death, it was incubation. Nothing here rushed toward a future. There was no forward motion to measure. There was only sideways endurance, life adjusting itself to pressure, to darkness, to time stretched thin. Survival became circular rather than linear. To exist was enough, and above it all, The sky remained distant and quiet, unaware of the persistence beneath. Ice reflected light back into space. Wind passed over frozen plains without touching what waited below. The surface looked still, but the planet was not empty. It was remembering how to wait. Life learned to slow its pulse without losing it. Beneath the long white ceiling, metabolism thinned itself into careful gestures. Every reaction mattered. Nothing was wasted. In the absence of abundance, efficiency became a quiet form of wisdom. Biology stopped rehearsing growth and practiced preservation instead. In the deep oceans, where pressure replaced temperature as the dominant presence, warmth persisted as a memory held by the planet's interior. Hydrothermal vents released mineral-rich breath into black water, creating pockets of sustained chemistry. These were not oases, they were continuations, places where the rules of surface life never fully applied, where energy arrived from below rather than above. Here, life did not wait for the sun, it listened to stone. Around these vents, organisms clustered not in competition, but in arrangement. Each form occupied a precise distance from heat and chemistry. Too close would dissolve, too far would starve. Balance was exact. Bodies adapted to gradients rather than seasons. Existence became positional rather than temporal. To survive was to remain correctly placed. Far from these warmth points, in the cold, dark plains of the abyss, life learned an even quieter discipline. Movement slowed to near stillness. Feeding occurred infrequently. Some organisms lived on what drifted down from worlds they would never see. Others consumed chemicals released from sediments, extracting energy from reactions that barely registered as activity. Life there did not express itself, it conserved itself. Beneath frozen continents, the story continued differently, but with the same restraint. Ice pressed downward, increasing pressure on bedrock, altering how water behaved at the microscopic level. Thin films of liquid persisted along grain boundaries, invisible but sufficient. In these narrow spaces, microbes endured, suspended between solid and liquid, awake but unhurried. Their survival was not dramatic enough to be noticed by time, but it was continuous. Genetic material learned patience here. DNA reduced error, slowed mutation, guarded instruction carefully. In stable cold, radical change was unnecessary and dangerous. Variation narrowed. Consistency became the safest path. This was not stagnation. It was archiving. The genome acted as a quiet library, holding stories that would not be read for tens of thousands of years. Above these interiors, the surface remained indifferent. Ice expanded and contracted slightly with distant orbital rhythms. Winds passed without consequence. The sky offered light without warmth, days without contrast. To the surface, nothing seemed to happen, but beneath it, life practiced the art of not needing to be seen. This inward retreat shaped future resilience. Species that endured the long sleep carried forward traits of efficiency, tolerance, and restraint. They did not emerge stronger in obvious ways. They emerged steadier, less dependent on surplus, more capable of waiting without failing. The Ice Age did not reward innovation. It rewarded survival without expression. Even larger organisms, where they existed, followed this inward logic. Activity reduced, migration narrowed, reproduction slowed or paused entirely. Some life forms entered extended dormancy, metabolic silence broken only by minimal maintenance. Others persisted in narrow refuges, coastal waters kept liquid by currents, underground chambers warmed by the Earth's breath. Life did not spread. It condensed. The planet's sleep was layered. At the surface, ice held stillness. Beneath, water moved slowly. Deeper still, heat rose steadily. Each layer followed its own rhythm, independent yet connected. This separation allowed continuity. While one system paused, another carried the thread forward. There was no fear in this arrangement. Life does not fear cold. It adapts to it, given time. The long sleep was not a crisis to be endured. It was a state to inhabit. Waiting was not passive. It was active restraint, the deliberate choice to remain unchanged until change became safe again. Above, the sky continued its pale watching, unaware of the endurance beneath. Ice reflected starlight back into space. Seasons passed without memory, but under that distance, the planet remained awake enough to remember itself. Because forgetting requires emptiness, and the Earth was never empty. It was simply quiet, holding its breath in many places at once, waiting for the moment when expression could return, without being lost. The waiting did not feel long to those who practiced it. Time behaves differently when nothing is trying to arrive. Beneath ice and stone, duration lost its edges. Moments did not stack into urgency. They spread outward into steadiness. Life adjusted its sense of enough. In the sediments beneath ancient seas, layers accumulated quietly, sealing pockets of warmth and chemistry inside. Within these compressed archives, organisms endured with minimal exchange, feeding on reactions so subtle they barely altered their surroundings. Survival became an agreement with environment rather than a contest against it. To remain was to interfere as little as possible. Cells learned how to repair rather than replace. Damage was corrected slowly, carefully. Replication paused when resources thinned. Some lineages reduced themselves to near stillness, conserving energy in molecular configurations designed for endurance. This was not retreat in fear. It was strategy shaped by deep time. The planet was teaching life how to be small without vanishing. Above the oceans, beneath frozen skies, larger systems followed similar logic. Ice sheets muffled sound, dampened vibration, stabilized temperature swings. This stability mattered. It allowed interior processes to continue uninterrupted. The surface appeared harsh, but beneath it, conditions were consistent. Predictability replaced abundance as the most valuable resource. In caves, fissures, and porous rock, water flowed slowly, warmed by the Earth's interior. These subterranean networks became quiet corridors of continuity. Nutrients moved gently. Microbial communities formed webs invisible to surface life, exchanging matter and energy with restraint. Intelligence here was not cognition, it was calibration. The long sleep refined patience into inheritance. Traits favoring speed faded. Traits favoring efficiency persisted. Life did not seek novelty, it safeguarded possibility. The genome became a container rather than an engine, storing arrangements that could awaken later when conditions softened. Nothing was wasted, everything was held. Even extinction, when it occurred, was absorbed quietly. Loss did not echo loudly in the deep. It created space without drama, allowing remaining systems to stabilize further. The planet did not erase life wholesale. It edited carefully, preserving continuity wherever it could. Silence became a filter rather than a void. The sky above remained distant, unchanged in its pale reflection. Light touched ice and returned upward. From the surface, the world appeared motionless. But beneath that stillness, layers of motion persisted, each following its own slow tempo. Heat rose, water circulated, chemistry rearranged itself endlessly. The planet's sleep was not uniform, it was distributed. This distribution mattered, because when warming eventually arrived, it would not awaken everything at once. Some systems would respond quickly, others would take centuries to notice. Life's staggered memory ensured resilience. No single failure could end what was spread across depths, sediments, and silence. The long sleep did not promise renewal, it allowed it. By holding life inward, the planet preserved options without forcing them into expression. Waiting became a form of care. The Earth learned that survival is not always about adaptation through change. Sometimes it is about adaptation through refusal to change at all. Beneath ice, beneath oceans, beneath stone, the living world practiced stillness as skill. It did not hurry the future. It trusted time to return warmth when it was ready. This trust was not belief, it was precedent. The planet had done this before, and as the cold continued to rest across the surface, the interiors remained awake enough to remember, enough to carry continuity forward, layer by layer, without asking to be seen. The sleep deepened, but it never became total. The planet does not surrender itself completely to stillness. It keeps a thin thread of motion alive, even in its quietest eras. Beneath the frozen sky, this thread wound through stone and water, through chemistry and pressure. binding life to continuity rather than progress. In the deep crust, heat moved upward with unbroken patience. It did not rush to correct the cold, it simply remained. This slow ascent of warmth created gradients, gentle transitions between survivable and silent. Life learned to settle into these gradients, not at the center of heat, not at the edge of ice, but in the narrow balances between. Existence became a matter of positioning rather than conquest. These interior spaces did not expand. They did not need to. Stability replaced growth as the measure of success. Communities persisted for spans of time too long to be counted in generations. Change, when it occurred, was subtle enough to feel like memory adjusting itself rather than something new emerging. Biology adopted the pace of geology, slow enough to be reliable, slow enough to endure. Above, the ice remained unmoved by the life beneath it. It pressed down, not as threat, but as insulation. Temperature fluctuations softened. The chaos of surface weather could not penetrate deeply. This buffering mattered. It gave the planet time to think, without interruption. While the sky repeated its pale cycles, the interior refined its quiet intelligence. The long sleep reshaped the meaning of resilience. Survival no longer depended on strength or speed. It depended on accuracy, on doing just enough, no more. Energy budgets tightened. Waste vanished. Systems learned how to recycle what little they had endlessly. Nothing was allowed to leak away into urgency. The planet became careful. This care extended even to memory itself. Genetic information stabilized. Variation slowed. Instead of branching outward, life folded inward, preserving a narrow set of instructions capable of lasting without reinforcement. This was not a failure of creativity. It was restraint in service of continuity. Possibility was stored, not spent. In this inward world, silence was not absence. It was space, a medium through which small changes could occur without disturbance. Reactions unfolded without noise. Adjustments took place without attention. The planet rested in a state where nothing demanded to be first or loud. Everything simply needed to remain. The sky above continued its distant watch, reflecting light away, holding the surface in brightness, without warmth. From far away, the earth would have appeared unchanged, white, pale, quiet. But appearance was no longer a reliable measure. Beneath that still surface, life had reorganized itself into a form that could not be seen but could not be erased. Time passed, but it did not accumulate pressure. It spread evenly, like sediment settling in calm water. This evenness prevented fracture. It allowed continuity to persist across intervals that might otherwise have broken fragile systems. The long sleep was not passive waiting. It was active stabilization. When minor fluctuations occurred, small pulses of warmth, brief shifts in chemistry, they were absorbed gently. Nothing overreacted. Nothing rushed to take advantage. The interior world had learned that responding too quickly could be as dangerous as not responding at all. Patience became embedded behavior. This period did not produce monuments. It produced foundations. Quiet ones. Invisible ones. The kind that would later support complexity without demanding recognition. When life eventually expanded outward again, it would do so on ground already trained in endurance. The planet did not dream during this sleep. Dreams require anticipation. This was deeper. It was memory holding itself intact, without needing to imagine what came next. The Earth did not plan its future. It simply refused to forget how to exist. And so, beneath the ice, beneath the pale and distant sky, life continued in its most careful form. Not striving, not changing, but remaining. Waiting not for warmth, but for permission to speak again. The sleep did not end when warmth began to return. It loosened. Like ice thinning from the edges inward, life did not wake all at once. Some parts remained folded long, after others stirred. The planet understands staggered awakening. It never asks everything to rise together. Beneath stone and sediment, the interior world lingered in its practiced stillness. Systems that had learned patience did not abandon it quickly. They tested change carefully, sensing whether warmth would stay or withdraw again. Memory made them cautious. The Earth does not trust the first sign of comfort. It remembers reversals. As temperatures softened at the surface, faint signals traveled downward. Chemistry adjusted its pace. Reactions accelerated slightly, then paused, listening for confirmation. Life did not rush toward expression. It waited for stability, for repetition, for assurance that this change would not betray it. Waiting had become instinct. In the deep oceans, currents altered their posture almost imperceptibly. Heat redistributed, nutrients stirred, but the abyss remained composed, holding on to the calm it had perfected. Darkness did not resist light. It simply did not need it. Some forms of life would remain there forever, unchanged, content in the sleep they never fully left. Under retreating ice, pressure eased slowly. Rock exhaled. Thin films of liquid widened just enough to allow movement again. Cells that had existed at the edge of activity expanded their metabolism by degrees, not awakening, adjusting. The long sleep did not collapse. It transformed into something quieter, vigilance. Above, the sky deepened its color. Blue returned unevenly, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. Clouds gathered differently. Winds learned new routes. But beneath all of this, the interior memory held steady. Life carried forward what the sleep had taught it, that silence can be active, that stillness can protect, that survival does not always require becoming visible. The planet itself shifted posture. Not abruptly, it never does. Ice receded, water flowed again. But the earth retained the inwardness the cold had cultivated. Even as forests would one day rise and animals would move freely across softened ground, the planet would remember how to pull itself inward when necessary. This memory mattered. It would be called upon again. Not as repetition, but as reference. The long sleep became part of Earth's inheritance, a deep instruction written into biology and stone alike. When future disruptions arrived, life would know how to retreat without disappearing, how to wait without losing itself. Nothing about this moment announced completion. There was no signal that the sleep had ended. It simply thinned into background, becoming a layer beneath all future activity. A quiet competence, a reserve of calm. Life did not thank the cold. It did not resent it either. It absorbed it, made it useful, incorporated its discipline into every future expression. The sleep beneath the sky became a permanent option, always available when the surface grew too loud, too fast, too unstable. And so, as warmth returned unevenly and the surface began to change again, the planet did not forget what it had practiced. Beneath movement, beneath growth, beneath noise, the long sleep remained accessible, intact, waiting, because the Earth never wakes completely. It keeps part of itself resting, part of itself listening inward. And when the sky grows distant again, when light thins and silence spreads, that inward world will still be there, awake enough to remember, patient enough to wait, quiet enough to endure. Cold does not stop at the surface. It rises. It lifts itself into the air and begins to rewrite how breath behaves. When ice spread across the land, the sky above it did not remain unchanged. Air learned new routes. Pressure rearranged itself. The invisible became structured. As continents cooled, temperature differences sharpened. The poles tightened their grip on cold, while equatorial warmth held its ground. Between these extremes, air began to move with greater purpose. Winds strengthened, not suddenly, but insistently. Paths that had once wandered now aligned. The atmosphere narrowed its choices, flowing where gradients insisted it should. The planet exhaled more slowly. Breath patterns changed. Cold air grew dense and heavy, sinking and spreading outward, pushing warmer air aside. This exchange did not feel dramatic. It felt deliberate. The sky learned how to circulate with discipline. Chaos softened into rhythm. Above the ice sheets, high-pressure systems formed and lingered. Air pressed downward, suppressing clouds, stretching silence across frozen plains. Storms learned to travel elsewhere, guided by boundaries invisible to the eye but firm in effect. Weather became directional. The atmosphere began to remember where it was allowed to move. Dust lifted from newly exposed ground and travelled farther than it ever had before. Fine particles, ground down by ice and carried by retreating waters, entered the air and did not fall quickly. Winds took them across oceans, across continents, writing pale signatures into ice and sediment thousands of miles from their source. The sky became a messenger, carrying fragments of land into places that had never known them. Clouds reorganized their habits. Some regions grew quieter, starved of moisture, learning how to wait. Others gathered clouds more readily, drawing precipitation into narrow corridors shaped by wind and cold. Deserts did not appear because water vanished. They appeared because air learned how to withhold it. Carbon moved differently now. With oceans colder and circulation altered, exchange between sea and sky shifted. Breath thickened. Gases lingered longer in some layers, sank faster in others. The atmosphere adjusted its composition without announcement, subtly reshaping climate through patience rather than force. Ice taught the wind how to repeat itself. Seasonal patterns became more pronounced. Monotony replaced surprise. This repetition mattered. It allowed the planet to stabilize into a state that could last. Variability narrowed. Extremes softened into predictability. The sky learned how to hold stillness as a form of balance. High above, jet streams tightened their paths, guided by contrasts sharpened by cold. They circled the planet like bands of memory, revisiting the same routes endlessly. These fast-moving rivers of air connected distant regions, transmitting the influence of ice far beyond its physical reach. Cold did not need to touch a place to shape it. The wind would arrive first. Storms, when they formed, carried new signatures. Their tracks lengthened, their energy redistributed. Some regions learned prolonged dryness, others endured persistent cold rain or snow. The atmosphere became uneven, but not unstable. Its asymmetry was organized. The sky itself felt lower during these ages, not in height, but in tone. Light scattered differently through cold air, colors muted, haze lingered. Sunlight reached the surface with less warmth, less urgency. Days felt flatter, stretched thin by reflection. The planet lived beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Yet even here, nothing was static. Air continued to move, to mix, to adjust. The long cold taught the atmosphere how to be dynamic without being chaotic. Motion did not disappear, it learned restraint. The wind, once nameless and wandering, acquired structure. It learned where to accelerate, where to pause, where to deposit what it carried. These patterns would persist long after the ice retreated, etched into climate, remembered by deserts, forests, and seas alike. Because when ice reshapes the land, it also reshapes the breath above it, and the sky, like stone and water, learns how to change. By learning how to repeat, as the cold persisted, the atmosphere learned memory. Not memory of events, but memory of pathways. Air began to return to the same routes again and again, tracing invisible corridors around the planet with growing certainty. What had once been tendency became habit. What had been habit became structure. The sky was no longer improvising. It was rehearsing itself. Over frozen continents, descending air pressed outward, spreading cold far from its source. This sinking breath did not rush. It pooled. It lingered. In these regions, the sky learned restraint, how to suppress motion without extinguishing it. Clouds thinned. Precipitation learned absence. The land below adapted to stillness not because water was gone, but because the air had learned how to hold it elsewhere. Farther away, where rising air gathered warmth and moisture, clouds thickened and returned repeatedly. Rain and snow fell along narrow bands, feeding some regions with regularity while leaving others untouched for ages. These were not accidents. They were the consequences of air learning where to gather and where to pass by without stopping. The planet was being partitioned by breath. Dust continued its long journeys. Fine grains lifted by persistent winds travelled across oceans, settling onto ice sheets, forests, and distant seas. Each particle carried a signature of its origin, altering chemistry wherever it landed. Iron-rich dust fed marine blooms far from shore. Pale sediments darkened ice, changing how it absorbed light. The wind did not merely transport matter, it redistributed influence. With repetition, the atmosphere's vertical structure refined itself. Layers sharpened, boundaries between warm and cold, dry and moist, grew more distinct. This stratification mattered. It controlled how storms formed, how energy moved, how sound and light travelled. The sky became layered like sediment, each level holding a different pace of motion. Breath itself felt different. In cold air, inhalation thickened. Density changed how sound carried, how wings lifted, how scent travelled. Life that moved through air adapted subtly, adjusting timing and effort. Even silence behaved differently under cold skies. Absorbing noise rather than scattering it, the atmosphere learned texture. Seasonality intensified. Summers shortened without disappearing. Winters lengthened without freezing everything solid. The contrast between them sharpened, not through extremes, but through persistence. Patterns repeated so reliably that ecosystems learned to anticipate rather than react. Migration routes aligned with wind corridors. Dormancy synced with pressure systems. Life listened upward as much as downward. High above, fast-moving currents tightened further, circling the globe with precision. These streams carried temperature signals across vast distances, linking distant climates into shared rhythms. A shift near the poles could echo at lower latitudes months later, carried by air that never touched the ground. The planet learned long-distance conversation through wind alone. Carbon exchange between land, sea, and sky followed these new rhythms. With colder oceans and altered winds, gas lingered longer in some layers, sank more readily in others. Breath cycles lengthened. The planet's exhale slowed. This did not announce itself as change. It arrived as adjustment, subtle enough to feel inevitable only in hindsight. The sky grew instructional. By repeating itself, it taught the surface how to endure consistency. Deserts learned patience. Ice learned persistence. Forests learned timing. The atmosphere became a teacher, not through force, but through reliability. When the wind returned the same way often enough, the land learned how to respond without surprise. Cold did not make the sky cruel. It made it disciplined. Motion continued everywhere, but it moved with purpose rather than excess. Energy travelled where it was permitted, not where it was wasted. This economy of movement allowed the Ice Age to persist without tearing the planet apart. The wind gained names not because it spoke, but because it behaved predictably enough to be recognized. Direction became identity. Pattern became character. The invisible grew familiar through repetition alone. And in this new familiarity, the sky ceased to be a backdrop. It became a surface, shaped, structured, rewritten by cold, carrying memory forward in motion, long after the ice itself would thin. As the sky settled into its new discipline, the planet began to feel distance differently. Places once loosely connected by wandering air became linked by steady flow, cold-stitched regions together that would never touch by land or sea. The wind became a translator, carrying the influence of ice across latitudes without pause or preference. In these long currents, time stretched. Air masses aged as they travelled, cooling, drying, gathering dust and memory. By the time they reached distant shores, they were no longer what they had been at their origin. They arrived altered, bearing the signature of every surface they had passed over. The atmosphere learned how to accumulate experience. Dust storms did not rage briefly and end. They persisted. Thin veils of particles remained suspended for seasons, softening sunlight, dulling colour, changing how heat reached the ground. The sky became hazed with its own history. This dimming was not dramatic enough to be feared, but steady enough to matter. It cooled surfaces further, reinforcing the cold that had taught the wind its roots in the first place. Clouds responded by becoming selective. They formed where air was allowed to rise and dissolved where descent dominated. Rain learned precision. Snow fell repeatedly in the same places, thickening ice where it already existed. Elsewhere, clouds passed overhead without releasing anything at all. The sky practiced preference. It did not distribute evenly. It distributed consistently. The sound of the world changed under this regime. Wind over ice produced long, low tones that travelled far across frozen plains. Over deserts, it whispered rather than roared, carrying grains in patient arcs. Over oceans, it organised waves into repeating patterns, teaching water how to mirror air. The atmosphere did not merely move above the surface. It impressed itself upon it. Life learned to read these patterns. Plants timed dormancy to pressure rather than temperature alone. Animals followed wind-shaped corridors that guided migration with less resistance. Even microbes responded to airborne dust and moisture, blooming or retreating in rhythm with atmospheric repetition. The sky became an unspoken calendar. High above, the layered structure of air grew more stable. Boundaries hardened between levels of motion, preventing sudden vertical mixing. Storms lost some of their chaos, gaining predictability instead. When violence occurred, it followed known paths. Surprise diminished. Endurance increased. The planet learned that stability does not require calm. It requires expectation. Breath itself became a shared experience across regions. A cold exhale near the poles would echo elsewhere weeks later, carried by moving air. The planet inhaled unevenly and exhaled slowly, redistributing energy with restraint. This long-breathing cycle softened extremes, allowing the ice age to persist without collapsing into total freeze or abrupt thaw. Even light adjusted its behavior. Scattered by dust and angled by low sun, it spread thinly across the surface. Shadows lengthened, contrast diminished. The world appeared flatter, quieter, less urgent. This visual calm mirrored the atmospheric one. The planet lived beneath a sky that discouraged suddenness. The wind, now trained by cold, became an archivist. It stored records of erosion, fire, volcanic ash, and distant seas in layers of air and ice. When these particles settled, they left evidence far from their source. The atmosphere wrote without ink, inscribing history into glaciers, soils, and ocean floors through repetition alone. Nothing about this system was permanent. The planet did not intend it to be. But while it lasted, it mattered deeply. The sky learned how to organize itself around absence, around the absence of warmth, of moisture, of variation. It became a structure shaped by what was missing. And when warmth would one day return, the wind would not forget these lessons. Patterns would loosen, but memory would remain. The atmosphere would remember how to tighten itself again, how to carry influence across distances, how to become disciplined when required. Because once the wind learns a name, it never entirely forgets how it was spoken. It carries that sound forward, folded into motion, waiting for the moment it is needed again. As the cold endured, the sky began to hold its shape longer. Transitions slowed. Shifts that once unfolded within days now took seasons to complete. The atmosphere learned how to linger in its decisions. This persistence mattered more than strength. It allowed patterns to deepen, to become recognizable enough for the surface to respond without confusion. Air pressure systems widened and stretched, occupying vast regions with steady influence. Beneath them, landscapes adjusted their expectations. Where pressure pressed downward, skies cleared repeatedly, and dryness learned how to last. Where air rose with consistency, clouds returned faithfully, delivering snow and rain with measured regularity. The sky became predictable enough to be trusted, even when it was harsh. Cold air pooled and spilled outward in long, shallow waves. These movements did not arrive as storms. They arrived as presence, a quiet cooling that settled into soil, into water, into the behavior of living things. Frost lingered longer at dawn. Heat retreated earlier at dusk. The atmosphere taught the surface how to stretch a season without announcing its arrival. Dust continued to travel, but now its journeys grew more refined. Winds no longer scattered particles randomly. They carried them along established corridors, lifting them, holding them, releasing them where motion slowed. This selective deposition mattered. It altered soil chemistry far from its source, feeding some ecosystems while dimming others. The sky learned how to distribute influence with precision. Over oceans, wind reorganized the surface into long, parallel waves, transferring momentum downward into currents that remembered their direction. Water responded by aligning itself with air, extending atmospheric patterns into the depths. The boundary between sky and sea softened. Motion crossed it easily. The planet behaved as a single breathing system, rather than separate layers. Even sound followed these new rules. In colder, denser air, noise travelled farther, but softened quickly. Echoes lengthened but lost their sharpness. The world sounded quieter, not because it was silent, but because energy dispersed more evenly. The sky learned how to absorb excess. Storms, when they formed, carried clearer signatures. Their tracks repeated, their durations stabilized. Violence did not vanish, but it became legible. This legibility allowed the land to recover more consistently. Erosion followed known paths. Accumulation occurred in familiar places. The atmosphere had taught the surface where to expect disruption and where to rest. The wind also shaped absence. In regions where it descended persistently, moisture rarely arrived. These places learned how to wait. Vegetation thinned without disappearing. Life adapted to intervals rather than events. Deserts formed not as failures, but as responses to reliable withholding. The sky was not denying water, it was redirecting it elsewhere. Above it all, sunlight continued to arrive at low angles, filtered by dust and cloud. Illumination spread thinly, reducing contrast, extending twilight. The world lived in long gradients, rather than sharp transitions. This visual softness echoed the atmospheric one. The planet learned how to exist without urgency pressing down from above. What emerged from this long instruction was not uniformity, but coherence. The atmosphere did not become simple. It became understandable. Its movements could be anticipated, its pauses felt before they fully arrived. This understanding mattered for everything beneath it. Survival favors predictability more than comfort. And as these patterns repeated over thousands of years, they etched themselves into memory. Not human memory, planetary memory. The kind that persists even when conditions change. When ice would eventually retreat, the sky would loosen its grip, but it would not forget how to tighten it again. Because the wind does not abandon what it has learned. It carries instruction forward, hidden inside motion, ready to be recalled. When cold once more asks the sky to become deliberate. The lesson did not end when the ice began to loosen. It rarely does. Long after glaciers thinned and retreated, the sky continued to behave as if cold were still listening. Patterns softened, but they did not disappear. The atmosphere does not forget easily. It carries memory in motion. As warmth returned unevenly, the wind tested its old paths. Some held, others dissolved gently, like names spoken less often but never fully erased. Air still remembered where it had once been disciplined, where gradients had guided it into patience. Even in change, restraint lingered. Dust fell more quickly now. Sunlight brightened, contrast sharpened, but the sky retained its sense of structure. It had learned how to organize itself around absence, and that skill did not vanish with abundance. Clouds gathered with intention. Storms still followed recognizable routes. Breath remained measured, even as it grew freer. The planet benefited from this inheritance. Landscapes shaped by long wind did not unravel when patterns loosened. Deserts did not suddenly bloom into confusion. Forests did not lose their timing. The atmosphere released its grip slowly, allowing the surface to adjust without shock. Memory softened transition. Carbon continued its quieter dance between sky and sea. Exchanges quickened, then slowed again, testing balance. The wind no longer dictated the same discipline, but it offered guidance. Motion remained legible. Extremes, when they arrived along familiar lines. The sky had learned how to warn without speaking. Even now, the sound of wind carries traces of that instruction. In cold regions, it still tightens, lowers its voice, stretches its notes across distance. In dry lands, it still withholds moisture with practiced patience. In storm belts, it still remembers how to repeat itself until land learns where to bend. The atmosphere became more than a response system. It became a memory system, a way for the planet to recall how it once survived long silence and long cold without freezing itself into failure. The sky learned how to be deliberate, and that deliberation never fully faded. What ice taught the wind was not cruelty or force. It taught economy, how to move only where necessary, how to repeat without wasting energy, how to connect distant places without touching them. These lessons remained folded into circulation, ready to surface when needed. When future cold would arrive, as it always does, The atmosphere would not need to relearn everything. It would tighten old pathways, strengthen familiar gradients, lift dust again into long journeys. The names would return, spoken by pressure and temperature rather than voice. The sky would remember how to become structured again. And even in warmth, even under open blue, that memory persists. In jet streams tracing ancient arcs, in deserts waiting patiently beneath clear skies, in clouds that gather where they always have. The wind still carries its old instructions, softened but intact, because the sky, like land and sea, is shaped not only by what is present, but by what once stayed long enough to teach it how to behave. Cold did not leave scars in the air, it left habits. And habits, once learned by the planet, become part of how it breathes forever. Warming did not arrive as relief. It arrived as permission, a loosening rather than an ending. The ice did not vanish in a single gesture, and the planet did not respond with celebration. It adjusted, slowly, carefully, as if testing whether warmth could be trusted to stay. The first signs were not visible from a distance. They were felt at the edges where ice met stone, where pressure had lingered longest. Melt began underneath, not on top. Thin films of water formed at the base of glaciers, whispering motion into places that had known only weight. The ice listened. It did not resist. It slid, fraction by fraction, guided by gravity it had always obeyed. Rivers remembered before they returned. Channels carved by absence reopened, accepting water as if it had never left. Flow followed paths taught by ice, wide and forgiving, unconcerned with speed. These were not youthful rivers, cutting sharply into land. They were older than motion itself, carrying melt with patience learned from pressure. Even now, their curves echo the resting places of glaciers long gone. Soils awakened unevenly. Where ice had ground stone into powder, the land absorbed warmth differently. Minerals exposed by erosion altered chemistry, shaping fertility without announcing it. The thaw did not make ground rich immediately. It made it capable. Capacity is quieter than abundance, but it lasts longer. The surface did not forget how to be cold. Shadows lingered. High places retained snow long after valleys softened. Nights released frost even as days warmed. This was not contradiction, it was layering. Warmth did not replace cold. It rested on top of it, like a new sentence written over an older one that still showed through. Life responded cautiously. Dormant systems stirred but did not rush. Seeds waited for repetition, not promise. Migration resumed along corridors carved by ice and widened by melt. The thaw did not invent new routes. It reopened old ones. Nothing returned to where it had been before. There was no before to return to. Oceans accepted meltwater without surprise. Sea levels rose slowly, spreading warmth across shelves once exposed to air. Coastlines shifted again, but this time with memory. Basins carved by ice filled gently, becoming lakes and seas that held the sky differently. Even water carried the imprint of pressure in its depth and clarity. The planet did not shed its ice age like a skin. It incorporated it. Rebound lifted land that had been pressed downward for millennia. Continents rose without noise, changing drainage patterns subtly, reshaping shores inch by inch. The earth stretched after a long stillness, not to stand taller, but to redistribute weight more comfortably. Atmosphere and surface negotiated continuously. As ice retreated, winds loosened but did not forget their discipline. Precipitation returned unevenly. Some regions bloomed, others waited longer. The thaw did not correct imbalance, it revealed it. Warmth exposed differences shaped by cold, making them visible without erasing them. Even fire, when it eventually returned, behaved differently on ground shaped by ice. It followed contours left by erosion, spread according to soils built from grinding and pressure. Regrowth mirrored these patterns. Nothing moved freely of what had come before. The thaw was not freedom. It was inheritance. Time did not accelerate with warmth. It remained layered. Cold memory slowed response, softened reaction, delayed extremes. The planet had learned modulation. It did not swing wildly between states. It transitioned, carrying weight forward even as conditions changed. This was the thaw that never fully left, not because ice remained everywhere, but because its instruction did. Every valley too wide for its river, every soil rich beyond its age, every coastline shaped by rising water carries evidence of a cold that still matters. The planet did not return to itself. It became something thicker, a world where warmth rests on memory, and memory quietly shapes how warmth behaves. As warmth spread, it did not erase the habits formed in cold. It moved across them carefully, like water flowing over stone already shaped by another hand. The planet did not relearn how to live. It adjusted how it remembered. The thaw unfolded as conversation rather than correction. Meltwater carried more than liquid. It carried history. Each stream held minerals released by grinding ice, particles shaped by pressure rather than weather. As these waters moved downslope, they rewrote chemistry quietly, enriching some places, thinning others. Fertility did not appear evenly. It followed the logic of past weight. The land responded not to temperature alone, but to what cold had prepared it to receive. Rivers lengthened their patience. Fed by slow release rather than sudden rain, they flowed steadily, widening rather than cutting. Floods arrived differently now, less violent, more persistent. Valleys, shaped by ice, accepted excess without collapse, spreading water across plains that would one day grow grass and forest. The thaw did not bring chaos. It brought redistribution. In high latitudes and elevations, ice lingered long enough to shape delay itself. Snowfields remained where shade and altitude allowed, feeding melt into summers that never fully warmed. These remnants mattered. They regulated flow, moderated climate locally, extended the memory of cold into seasons that appeared warm from afar. The planet kept reminders close. Beneath the surface, rock responded slowly to the loss of pressure. Rebound lifted continents imperceptibly, altering gradients with patience equal to the ice that had pressed them down. Shorelines shifted again, not because water rose alone, but because land rose too. This mutual adjustment complicated every boundary. Nothing moved in isolation. Soils thickened unevenly. Where ice had lingered longest, grinding deepest, the ground held moisture and nutrients more readily. Elsewhere, thinner soils learned restraint. Vegetation followed these differences instinctively, spreading where the land invited it, waiting where it did not. The thaw did not promise uniform growth. It offered opportunity shaped by history. Life emerged cautiously from its inward posture. Dormancy loosened, activity increased, but the lessons of waiting did not vanish. Species that expanded too quickly met limits, shaped by cold memory, short seasons, unstable ground, delayed warmth. Adaptation favored those who listened to the land rather than outran it. Survival remained a dialogue. The atmosphere adjusted alongside the surface. As ice retreated, albedo shifted, allowing more heat to settle rather than reflect. Winds loosened their grip, but retained structure. Precipitation patterns softened without dissolving. Storms arrived with familiarity rather than surprise. The sky, too, carried the imprint of restraint. In the oceans, meltwater altered circulation slowly, layering fresh over salt, changing density and motion. These adjustments rippled outward, influencing climates far from any glacier. Warmth did not move freely. It negotiated with cold memory stored in currents and depth. The sea absorbed change, delayed it, redistributed it across time. Nothing about this period felt decisive. There was no moment when cold ended and warmth began. The transition blurred. Seasons overlapped. Contradictions coexisted. Ice remained in shadows while flowers appeared in light. The planet tolerated this complexity without urgency. It had learned how to hold opposites without fracture. Even silence changed character. The quiet of ice was replaced by the quiet of adjustment, a world listening to itself recalibrate. Sounds returned gradually, flowing water, moving air, life stirring without announcement. Noise did not replace silence. It layered over it, allowing memory to persist beneath activity. The thaw did not restore what had been. Restoration implies return. This was continuation. The planet carried its cold forward, embedding it into behavior rather than surface. Warmth arrived, not to overwrite, but to coexist. The Earth did not forget how to be cold. It learned how to be warm without losing what cold had taught it. And so the thaw remained incomplete by design. Not because ice refused to leave, but because its instructions stayed embedded. Warmth settled gently, aware of the weight beneath it, moving carefully across a surface that remembered how much pressure it could hold. As warmth continued its careful advance, the planet began to express change without forgetting restraint. Growth returned, but it did not rush. Forests did not surge forward as conquest. They crept, testing ground shaped by pressure and patience. Roots explored soils still young, still remembering stone. Where the land accepted them, they stayed. Where it hesitated, they waited. Expansion learned humility from cold. Water moved differently now. Melt no longer dominated the rhythm. Rain joined the conversation, falling into landscapes already prepared to receive it. Valleys widened by ice spread flow across their floors, turning motion into nourishment rather than erosion. Rivers braided themselves through plains, revisiting channels without insisting on permanence. The land allowed change without demanding it settle. The memory of ice appeared most clearly in places where it was no longer visible. Hills rolled gently where peaks once stood sharp. Lakes rested in basins too deep for their present rivers to explain. Coastlines curved in ways that suggested absence rather than force. These forms did not announce their origin. They simply existed, quiet evidence that pressure had once rested there long enough to matter. Life followed these shapes instinctively. Migration paths curved through glacial corridors. Herds and forests moved where passage had been made easy by long-vanished ice. Even human paths, much later, would trace these same routes, guided without knowing by landscapes softened into invitation. The thaw did not invent direction, it revealed it. In colder regions, permafrost loosened cautiously. Ground thawed in layers, releasing water and gases with care rather than collapse. This gradual release mattered. It prevented sudden loss, allowed systems to adjust. Where thaw proceeded too quickly, instability followed, reminding the planet that memory resists being hurried. The Earth does not punish speed, it simply exposes its cost. Beneath warming seas, the ocean continued its role as mediator. It absorbed heat slowly, storing it at depth, releasing it back to the surface over long intervals. This buffering softened extremes, delayed consequences. The sea remembered how to hold cold and applied that skill to warmth, preventing the planet from forgetting moderation. Ice remnants persisted where geometry allowed north-facing slopes, high plateaus, shaded basins. These survivors were not failures of thaw, they were reminders. Their meltwater fed streams late into summer, sustaining flow when rain fell elsewhere. The planet keeps fragments of its past, not out of nostalgia, but utility. Atmospheric patterns adjusted again, loosening but not dissolving. Winds retained familiar corridors, though they wandered more freely now. Storms varied without becoming chaotic. The sky, like the land, layered new behavior over old instruction. Change did not require amnesia. The most profound transformation was internal. The planet learned that transitions need not erase what preceded them, that memory can coexist with motion, that history does not need to be visible to remain influential. Warmth rested on cold like a second skin, thinner but responsive, shaped by what lay beneath. Time felt different in this world, not faster, more elastic. The planet responded to input with delay, with moderation, with patience learned from ice. This elasticity allowed life to adjust, to recover from disturbance without collapse. Resilience became structural rather than reactive. Nothing here suggested an ending. The thaw did not close a chapter, it folded it. Cold remained present as outline, as guidance, as quiet constraint shaping how warmth behaved. Even now, long after ice retreated from most places, its weight remains felt in the way rivers curve, soils hold, climates hesitate. The Earth does not move cleanly from one state to another. It carries each state forward, layered into the next. And so the thaw never fully left, because it never fully arrived. It became part of the planet's posture. Warmth learned to move carefully, over a surface that remembered pressure and remembered how to endure it. As warmth lingered longer each year, the planet began to test continuity, not whether ice would disappear, but whether memory could remain without it. The Earth does not abandon what has shaped it. It adjusts its grip, loosening slowly, ensuring that nothing essential slips away too quickly. Vegetation thickened where soils allowed it, but growth followed restraint. Roots did not penetrate deeply all at once. They traced paths softened by frost and pressure, respecting boundaries etched by cold. Forests formed in mosaics rather than walls, leaving open spaces where the land still remembered scarcity. These gaps were not failures, they were breathing spaces, intervals, left intentionally by history. Water continued its patient redistribution. Wetlands spread where ice had once paused, holding moisture gently, releasing it slowly. These places moderated extremes, absorbing flood and drought alike. They were not accidents of thaw. They were echoes, landforms tuned by ice to manage change without collapse. The planet learned how to store balance. Stone itself adjusted to warmth with care. Cracks widened slowly. Minerals reacted cautiously. Chemical weathering replaced mechanical force, softening surfaces without erasing structure. The pace of change slowed even as activity increased. This balance mattered. It allowed the surface to respond without unraveling what had been carefully arranged under pressure. Life expanded into complexity, but it carried forward the discipline of waiting. Ecosystems assembled in layers, each one responding to constraints left behind by ice. Some species thrived in short seasons, others specialized in marginal ground. Diversity did not mean abundance everywhere. It meant suitability life finding where it belonged within inherited limits. Even disturbances behaved differently now. Floods followed wide valleys shaped by glaciers, spreading energy rather than concentrating it. Fires moved along contours influenced by moisture and soil patterns left by cold. Regrowth mirrored these paths, repeating layouts long after their cause had vanished. The thaw did not free the land from structure. It revealed how deeply structure had been set. The atmosphere continued its negotiation with the surface. As ice retreated, reflection diminished, allowing more heat to settle. But feedback unfolded gradually. Winds adjusted their routes, clouds reorganized their habits. Climate did not leap forward. It eased into warmth with the caution of a system that remembered sudden reversals. In high places, lingering snowfields and small glaciers persisted as quiet moderators. Their melt arrived late, extending coolness into warm seasons, softening transitions. These remnants were not relics. They were functional memories, preserving balance through delay. The planet values delay when change threatens to arrive too quickly. Time itself felt weighted, not slowed but tempered. Responses were buffered, extremes were absorbed. The Earth had learned how to carry inertia, how to resist immediate reaction without becoming stagnant. This quality, born in ice, persisted into warmth, shaping how the planet handled every disturbance that followed. Nothing about this phase suggested closure. The thaw did not resolve tension between cold and warmth. It made room for both. The planet settled into a layered existence, where past conditions continued to guide present behavior. Memory did not fade into background. It remained active, shaping response without demanding attention. Even now, the Earth carries this posture. Rivers still follow paths too wide for their flow. Soils still bear minerals ground fine by vanished glaciers. Climates still hesitate, moderated by oceans and landforms trained in patience. The ice is mostly gone, but its influence is everywhere. The thaw did not replace the ice age. It absorbed it, folded its lessons inward, and so the planet learned how to change, without forgetting how much pressure it once held, and how carefully it learned to release it. The release did not complete itself. It never does. The planet does not let go in clean gestures. It loosens, then keeps a hand on what mattered. Long after the last great sheets withdrew, long after rivers found steady voices again, the Earth continued to behave as if weight might return at any moment. Warmth settled in layers, not declarations. Summers lengthened, but they carried hesitation. Winters softened, but they remembered how to stay. The surface learned a new balance, one that allowed growth without forgetting restraint. The planet did not rush to spend what it had saved during cold. It invested carefully. The most enduring traces of ice lived where nothing appeared frozen, in soils that held water longer than rain could explain, in valleys too wide for the rivers that occupied them, in coastlines shaped by seas that rose slowly, then paused, as if listening. These forms did not announce themselves as history. They functioned as guidance. Life moved forward carrying this guidance quietly. Forests leaned into seasons shaped by delay. Grasslands thrived where moisture spread rather than surged. Animals followed routes eased by ancient erosion. Paths smoothed long before they were needed. Even disturbance learned moderation. Recovery arrived not as miracle, but as rhythm. The planet had learned that change does not need to erase what came before, that memory can remain structural rather than visible, that the most reliable systems are those shaped by endurance rather than urgency. Warmth did not overwrite cold, it rested upon it, inheriting its discipline. In the oceans, deep currents continued to carry cold signatures forward, redistributing heat with patience. In the atmosphere, wind patterns retained echoes of structure learned under ice. In stone, rebound continued its slow ascent, adjusting shorelines by degrees too small to feel. Nothing stopped, nothing hurried. The thaw became a background condition always present, never complete. A reminder that even in warmth, the planet remembers how to be careful. That even in abundance, it retains the option of restraint. Ice had taught the Earth how to hold, and thaw taught it how to release, without forgetting how to hold again. This balance would matter later. It would be tested again. The planet does not practice lessons it does not expect to reuse. The memory of ice became part of Earth's posture toward every future shift, warming, cooling, disruption, recovery. A deep confidence born from having survived pressure without breaking. And so the thaw never fully left, because it never fully arrived. It became a condition rather than a moment, a layering rather than a return. Warmth learned how to move slowly, over a world that remembered weight, and memory learned how to remain, without demanding to be seen. The planet did not step out of its ice ages. It carried them forward, quietly, patiently, as part of how it learned to endure change itself. Nothing that mattered remained untouched. Not hills, not valleys, not the quiet curve of a distant shore. What exists now is not what survived. It is what was left behind. The surface of the planet did not become what it is through accumulation alone. It became legible through removal, through what withdrew, through what stayed long enough to take something away and then leave silence in its place. Ice ages were not chapters of addition. They were acts of subtraction so slow they felt like patience itself. Every hill learned its shape by losing height. Every valley learned its width by losing walls. Every shoreline learned its curve by losing certainty. Absence became the author. Where ice rested longest, the land speaks most quietly. Smooth stone, wide plains, gentle slopes, these are not signs of ease. They are records of endurance, pressure applied without interruption until sharpness surrendered, until complexity simplified itself into something that could last. The planet did not mourn what vanished. Mountains lowered into usefulness. Rivers widened into generosity. Soils appeared not where stone stood proud, but where it had been ground fine enough to remember water. What disappeared did not leave emptiness. It left possibility. The earth learned to write without ink. It wrote with weight, with friction, with time applied evenly enough to feel like stillness. Its sentences are not read left to right. They are walked across, touched, inhabited. A plain is a paragraph. A valley is a pause. A coastline is a thought that never fully settles. What makes the surface intelligible is not what stands tallest. It is what has been reduced until it can be read. The most influential shapes are rarely the most dramatic. They are the ones that invite continuation paths instead of barriers, basins instead of walls. Life did not invent this language. It inherited it. Roots follow fractures opened by frost long before plants existed. Rivers trace corridors widened by ice that never saw water. Movement of animals, of air, of thought follows routes made by disappearance rather than construction. Intelligence did not dominate this surface. It learned how to navigate it. Even now, absence continues to instruct. Where glaciers once rested, rivers hesitate. Where ice once pressed, land rebounds slowly, as if still listening for weight. Where seas once withdrew, coastlines curve inward, unsure whether return is finished. The planet behaves as though something might still come back. Because something always does. The ice did not leave behind monuments. It left behind conditions. It taught the Earth how to survive by letting go, how to reshape itself not through force, but through endurance. The surface became a record not of conquest, but of restraint practiced long enough to matter. What vanished shaped everything that remained, and what remains still carries the outline of what is gone. To read the planet is to read what is no longer there. The Earth does not archive its past in objects. It archives it in gaps, in spaces where something once pressed long enough to leave instruction behind. Presence leaves marks. Absence leaves structure. The land learned this slowly. It learned that removal could be a form of care, that lowering a mountain could create passage, that emptying a basin could prepare it to hold water again. Ice did not sculpt by adding detail. It sculpted by simplifying until movement became possible without resistance. What remained was not weakened, it was clarified. Consider the valleys that stretch wider than their rivers deserve. Water today seems too small for the work it inhabits. These channels were not cut by the streams that now occupy them. They were made by weight that no longer exists. Rivers did not earn these spaces. They inherited them. Flow learned humility by entering corridors shaped by absence. The same is true of plains that feel unfinished, open in a way that resists explanation. These expanses are not emptiness. They are aftermath. Mountains were once distributed here, grain by grain, reduced until height became fertility. Dust remembers more than stone. It remembers pressure. It remembers time applied gently enough to become soil. Shorelines curve as if undecided. They advance, retreat, hesitate. Seas do not sit where they once did, nor where they might again. The coast is a sentence interrupted repeatedly, each pause reshaping meaning. What was submerged learned to be land. What was land learned to wait. Neither forgot the other. The edge is always provisional. Even the air reads absence. Winds still follow corridors cooled by ice long gone. Storms gather where pressure once learned to linger. Deserts wait where clouds were taught to pass without stopping. The sky remembers boundaries that no longer appear. Breath moves according to maps, erased from the surface but preserved in motion. Life adapted not by inventing new terrain, but by learning to interpret what disappearance left behind. Roots enter fractures frost once widened. Migration follows passes lowered by ice rather than carved by feet. Settlement gathers near water held by basins formed through removal. Intelligence here is not creation, it is recognition. What seems natural is often inherited. What feels obvious was once improbable. A fertile plain, a gentle valley, a navigable coast. These are not defaults, they are outcomes. They exist because something else endured long enough to erase what stood in the way. The planet does not hide this, it embeds it. Memory is not stored as nostalgia, it is stored as form. To walk across the earth is to move through sentences written by what is missing. Every step crosses a choice made by pressure rather than will, and disappearance continues, not only through ice, but through time itself. Erosion never stops, rivers rearrange, coasts migrate. Even the quiet lifting of land after weight is removed is a kind of delayed absence, the echo of pressure remembered after it has gone. The earth is always responding to what is no longer present. This response does not seek restoration. There is no return. There is only layering. Each absence becomes a foundation for the next presence. Each removal prepares the surface for a different kind of endurance. The planet does not correct itself, it continues. In this way, intelligence emerges not as dominance over environment, but as fluency within it. To live here is to learn how to read a surface written by loss without mistaking it for failure, to understand that what vanishes often leaves behind the conditions for what follows. The ice did not forget the land. The land did not forget the ice. They remain folded into one another, presence shaped by absence, motion guided by what once stood still, and the surface continues to speak, not in what it holds, but in what it has let go. Absence is not empty, it is shaped. It has weight without mass, influence without form. The planet learned this through ice, but it practices it everywhere. What disappears does not leave a void. It leaves instructions the future cannot ignore. The land remembers removal, the way skin remembers pressure long after a hand lifts away. Valleys retain their breadth, slopes hold their patience, basins keep their readiness. Even when the cause has gone, the response remains, quietly governing how water moves, how soil gathers, how life chooses where to linger. The surface behaves as if something might return, because it once did. Time does not erase these responses, it deepens them. Each rainstorm, each thaw, each season of growth and retreat reinforces shapes first learned through absence. Rivers follow generosity already granted. Roots enter permissions already opened. The earth rarely invents new roots when old ones still work. Memory is efficient. In places where ice never touched, disappearance still speaks. Wind removes, water dissolves, heat loosens bonds until solidity thins into dust. The lesson is the same. Endurance often arrives through subtraction. The planet does not cling to excess. It refines, it edits. What remains is not the strongest, but the most usable. This usability is what intelligence recognizes. Not immediately, not consciously, but inevitably. Minds emerge into landscapes already softened into legibility. Thought follows contours it did not make. Curiosity gathers where valleys open. Movement prefers paths lowered by forces too old to name. Intelligence does not dominate the surface. It aligns with it. Even error follows disappearance. Where land is too thin, growth hesitates. Where water is withheld, life learns to wait or move on. These constraints are not punishments. They are boundaries written by what once withdrew. Limits are not failures of generosity. They are the grammar of continuation. The planet does not offer certainty. It offers guidance shaped by loss. Coastlines that shift teach flexibility. Rivers that change course teach attention. Soils that vary teach respect for place. These lessons are not moral. They are structural. The earth instructs through form, not command. As ages pass, disappearance becomes cumulative. Each removal stacks upon earlier ones, creating layers of absence that shape behavior long after memory fades. Ice removes height. Water removes sharpness. Time removes insistence. What remains is a surface capable of holding complexity without breaking under it. The most profound quiet lies here not in frozen silence, but in continuity that does not announce itself. The planet continues not because everything stays, but because enough is removed to allow movement to continue. Stability is achieved not through preservation, but through ongoing release. To walk this surface is to walk through a text written without words, a language where what is missing carries as much meaning as what remains, where disappearance is not tragedy, but technique, where loss is not failure, but authorship. The ice was one author among many. It taught the earth how to write by leaving, how to shape a future by stepping back slowly enough to leave structure behind. That lesson was never isolated to cold. It spread into water, wind, stone, and time itself. And so the planet remains readable, not because it explains itself, but because it continues to remove what no longer serves the next sentence. The surface is not finished. It is being revised even now, by rain, by warmth, by patience applied evenly across centuries. What has vanished still guides the hand that writes next. What is gone still determines where weight can rest. The Earth does not remember its ice ages as events. It remembers them as method, and that method continues, quietly shaping the surface, through disappearance alone. What endures longest is not what resists removal, but what learns how to remain useful after it. The planet refined this understanding through repetition. Ice withdrew, water followed, wind erased edges, time softened insistence. With each absence, the surface did not weaken. It clarified. Hills that seem modest once carried ambition. Their quiet curves are not natural defaults, they are conclusions reached slowly. Valleys that feel welcoming were widened by pressures that no longer exist. Shorelines that invite return are shaped by seas that came and went without promise. The earth offers hospitality because it has learned how much must be taken away for movement to feel safe. This safety is subtle. It is not protection from change, it is protection for change. Wide valleys allow rivers to wander without tearing themselves apart. Gentle slopes let forests shift without collapse. Layered soils hold water without drowning roots. These permissions are authored by disappearance. They exist because something stood in the way and then left. The planet learned to anticipate absence. After enough removals, the surface behaves as if pressure might arrive again. Ground remains flexible, systems keep slack, nothing locks itself into a single solution. This preparedness is not anxiety, it is memory translated into posture. The earth stands ready to yield. Intelligence, when it appears, inherits this posture. It finds landscapes already tuned to adjustment. Thought settles where paths exist. Culture gathers near water held by basins shaped by loss. Movement follows corridors lowered by forces that did not know they were preparing routes. Minds do not invent legibility, they arrive into it. Even misunderstanding is shaped by absence. When intelligence mistakes dominance for mastery, the surface responds by reminding it of limits written long before. Floods spread across plains designed to absorb them. Coasts retreat along curves that have practiced retreat before. The planet does not argue, it reveals structure. Disappearance continues its quiet work. Glaciers are fewer now, but erosion remains. Water carries grains away, wind lifts dust, heat loosens bonds. The same method persists across different hands. Removal is not an episode, it is a habit the earth never abandoned. What appears permanent is only what has not yet been edited. Time will return to it gently, not to destroy, but to make it readable again. The surface accepts this because it has learned that readability matters more than height, more than certainty, more than endurance without use. Silence deepens here, not the silence of nothingness, but the silence of understanding. The planet does not need to announce its methods. They are visible everywhere in what has been lowered, widened, softened, and shared. The land speaks through generosity learned from loss, and so the surface remains open, not finished, not defended. It invites revision because revision is how it survives. What disappeared did not fail. It completed its work, and what remains continues, guided by that absence, prepared to let go again, when the next sentence requires space. In the end, the planet did not keep the ice. It kept what the ice taught it. Everywhere, the surface bears this quiet inheritance, not as scars, not as monuments, but as posture. Hills that do not insist, valleys that make room, shores that hesitate before committing. The earth learned that endurance is not the act of holding everything, but the practice of letting enough go. The cold withdrew, but it did not take its grammar with it. That grammar remains embedded in slope and curve, in the way water spreads instead of strikes, in the way soil accepts roots without demanding certainty. What vanished shaped the sentence that followed. What followed learned how to listen. Time continued, as it always does. Warmth came, forests rose, oceans breathed more freely, winds loosened their discipline. And still, beneath every motion, the old instruction persisted. Movement was guided by absence. Growth was moderated by memory. Change arrived, knowing where the land could bend without breaking. Intelligence, when it finally looked back, found no single moment to point to. No beginning, no ending. Only a surface that seemed already prepared, already legible, already shaped into something that could be read rather than conquered. Thought did not stand above this ground. It stood within it, learning by following the lines left behind. Every path taken was once an emptiness opened by pressure. Every shelter found was once a lowering. Every fertile place was once stone reduced patiently enough to remember water. The planet did not forget the ice ages. Forgetting would have meant erasure. Instead, the earth folded them inward, where memory does its most durable work, in stone, in chemistry, in the long delays that soften response and preserve balance. What looked like disappearance became method. Even now, the earth behaves as if something might return, as if weight could arrive again, as if cold might ask for space. Rivers leave room to wander. Coasts keep curves practiced in retreat. Climate hesitates, buffered by oceans and landforms trained in patience. The planet keeps its options open. This is not caution born of fear. It is confidence born of survival. The surface remains writable because it has learned the value of erasing carefully, not all at once, not violently, but slowly enough that what remains can carry what comes next. Revision is not failure, it is fidelity to time. And so the story does not conclude. It exhales, it settles, it returns to where it began, not to repeat, but to remember. What if Earth once knew something and did not forget? It knew how to endure by letting go. It knew how to shape life by stepping back. It knew that disappearance, practiced patiently, could become a form of wisdom. The planet did not lose its ice. It learned how to live with the memory of it, quietly, deeply, waiting.